Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library royallib.com, https://royallib.com. All books by the author, https://royallib.com/author/Bolgarov_Nikolai.html. The same book in other formats, https://royallib.com/book/Bolgarov_Nikolai/parahod.html. Enjoy reading. Nicholas Bolgarov. Steamboat. Part 1. From Chelm to Electric Ship. The story begins with a boat. Look closely at the drawing. Here it is, a modern steamer. Well, the Hulk. If such a ship is placed vertically, then it will probably be higher than the new building of Moscow University. One pipe is worth something, and that ship that is depicted next to it will freely pass through it, of course, if you remove the masts and sails from it. This ship, the famous Koch, is one of those on which our brave sailor ancestors went on long voyages along the northern coast of Asia. Now you see the difference between modern steamships and those ships that plowed the seas 300 or 400 years ago? And even before there were none. But what happened? Let's make an excursion to the Central Naval Museum, which is located in Leningrad. In the huge room of this museum, many models of various ships are collected. There are all sorts of things here, wooden and steel, multi-oared galleys and graceful sailing clippers, small torpedo boats and mighty battleships, submarines and many others. Whatever the model, then a page in the history of shipbuilding. And at the entrance to the hall is the most interesting, unusual model. The fact of the matter is that this is not a model, but a real dugout boat, the great-grandfather of all modern marine giants. On a copper plate nailed to the stand, it is written, a one-tree canoe raised from the bottom of the southern Bug River by a Soviet expedition in 1937. The boat is 3,000 years old. This means that already at least 3,000 years ago, a person moved along the rivers of our country on such a vessel as a canoe hollowed out of a tree trunk. The dugout boat is the great-grandfather of all modern ships. It is with such boats that the history of the steamer begins. It is hard to say when and where it was first noticed that the tree trunk does not sink and helps to float on the water. In any case, rafts were known to primitive people. It was convenient to swim across rivers on them, and cargo could be transported. And some tribes over time improved them so much that they even began to go out to the open sea. You must have read about the brave Norwegian Heyerdahl. He built the Kon-Tiki raft exactly on the model of the ancients and was not afraid to sail about 8,000 kilometers along the waves of the Pacific Ocean on it with a few friends. Raft Kon-Tiki on the waves of the Pacific Ocean. Yes, but it's good to have the right trees on hand. On the banks of the Volga, for example, there were such lime trees that, in addition to rowers, 10 horses were placed in canoes hollowed out of their trunks. And if there were no forests nearby? And many peoples of antiquity had to, and some still have to, look for a way out of this situation. They built it in different ways, and in some places they are still building shuttle pies. Some knitted them from bundles of reed papyrus. You can guess that they were Egyptians. Others wove a frame from rods and sheathed it with skins, or even wove something like a basket and coated it with resin. And some Slavic tribes sheathed boats not only with skins, but also with bark. Our modern word ship comes precisely from the words bark, box. The ancient man did not immediately master the control of the canoe. At first, he acted only with a pole, pushing off from the bottom. But then the pole was replaced with a long stick with a wide and flat end. So the oar appeared, the first means for the movement of ships in the history of navigation. Later, people improved the boats, increased their size. Appeared, for example, printed boats. This is the same dugout boat, but boards were nailed to its sides to make them higher. The construction of a rammed boat was a difficult and long undertaking. They looked for a large tree in the forest, an oak or a linden. After many hours of felling, they threw him to the ground. Then the tree trunk was burned and hollowed for a long time. But often they did it differently. A deep crack was made in the tree, which was still on the vine. This crack was gradually widened with wedges and struts, forming an artificial hollow. The tree continued to grow, and the hollow continued to grow. This went on for several years. Then the tree was cut down, its trunk was steamed and finally processed with an axe. Boards for such one-tree decks were nailed with wooden nails or sewn with willow twigs. On such boats, our ancestors, the Slavs, fearlessly went out into the sea. Our ancestors went to sea on such boats. The paddle boats were successfully used by the Zaporizhia Cossacks in their raids on Turkish lands. The Cossacks called such ships seagulls, and this name was the best fit for fast and seaworthy boats. In the upper part of the side, around the entire prow, a thick reed belt was attached, tied with a bast. He did not let the seagull drown in excitement. The seagull had 10 to 16 oars and a small sail that helped the rowers with a fair wind. On a seagull, about 20 meters long, 50, 70 Cossacks fit, and they themselves worked together and made their ship in just 2 weeks. Large fleets of Zaporizhia gulls roamed the entire Black Sea. They sank Turkish ships and made daring attacks on seaside towns. Here is how the great Russian writer N.V. Gogol describes the courage of the Cossacks in Historic Taras Bulba. He did a lot under his adamantship of sea campaigns, but the trip to the Anatolian shores was the most glorious of all. Then they scored a lot of sequins, expensive Turkish garba, kinjaks and all sorts of decorations, but mumbled grief on a turning point, they got caught, hardy, under Turkish cause. As there were enough of them from the ship, half of the canoes spun and turned over, sinking more than one into the water, but reeds tied to the sides saved the canoes from sinking. Balaban sailed away at all oars, stood straight to the sun, and through that became invisible to the Turkish ship. All night long afterwards they scooped up water with scoops and caps, patching up broken places, sails were cut from Cossack trousers, they rushed and fled from the fastest Turkish ship. Over time, one-tree boats ceased to satisfy people. After all, they were bulky and little roomy. And it was necessary to transport more and more cargo, farther and farther. Trade developed. Waterways were the main ones, since there were very few roads on land then, if not at all. Gradually, people, in order not to depend on the size of the tree trunk, learned to put together large, durable ships from individual beams and boards. At first they were open at the top, but soon the hulls began to be decked and even superstructures were made. In Rus, this invention was attributed to the Kiev prince Izyaslav, 12th century. This is how the chronicler describes these vessels. Izyaslav contrived the load miraculously, the rowers in them row invisibly, only the oars are visible. It is covered with boards, and at the top the soldiers stand in armor and shoot. And there are 2 feeders, one at the stern, the other at the bow. In order not to turn around at a dangerous moment, steering oars were placed on this ship both at the stern and at the bow and protected the helmsman with a canopy. In the ancient world, typeset deck ships were known as early as 1000 years BC. The Egyptians specially equipped expeditions for building timber to the coast of Syria, in order to build large and strong ships from cedar and the best woods. Under Pharaoh Ramses III, there were already 5 shipyards in Egypt. Structure of the hull of an old Russian ship, Pomako of the 16th to 17th centuries. 1. Stem, 2. Keel, 3. Keelson, inner keel, 4. Frames, 5. Beams, 6. Knees, 7. Pillars, 8. Carlings, 9. Sternpost, 10. Inner lining, 11. Outer skin, 12. Bulwark, 13. Gunwale, upper bulwark bar, 14. Deck flooring, 15. Steering wheel, 16. Hatch. The construction of the vessel began with the laying of a long and thick timber. It was the longitudinal base of the ship, the keel. At the ends, strong inclined bars were attached to it, stems. They created the outlines of the bow and stern of the ship. On the keel were placed transverse bars, frames. And on top of the frames they laid another longitudinal beam, keelson. Ribs, frames, were bent up and fastened along the sides with long longitudinal bars. The upper ends of the frames were tied across the vessel with several, slightly curved upwards, beams. This is how the skeleton of the ship turned out. It remained to sheathe it with thick boards and fill the deck. To prevent water from leaking through the cracks at the joints of the boards, these cracks were filled with putty from finely crushed seashells. The Romans began to do things differently, and they hammered crushed oilseeds into the cracks. Much later, people learned to caulk such cracks with hemp and fill them with liquid resin. By the way, if you look closely at the models of ships from different eras and different peoples exhibited in the Maritime Museum, one circumstance catches your eye. In the internal structure of their hulls, we notice some similarities. When we consider the design of the hull of a modern steamer, you will see that it has something in common even with the structure of the hull of the ancient Egyptian ship. Although they are separated by 3,000 years, they are made of different materials, and it is difficult to compare them in size. You will see that over time the size of the ships increased. And the larger the ship, the greater must be the force that moves it. In other words, it was necessary to increase the number of rowers. They no longer fit on the same deck. It was necessary to install oars in 2 or even 3 tiers. So in ancient Greece, Rome and other countries, 2- and 3-deck ships appeared. The most common was the trireme or trireme, with 3 tiers of oars, the total number of which reached 200. The oars on the triremes were of various lengths, depending on which tier they were in. Therefore, stronger rowers were placed on the upper deck. After all, they had to wield the longest, and therefore heavy, oars. In order to row with one oar of the upper row, 10 rowers had to be put on large ships. You can see one of these oars here. In the museum, it almost reaches the ceiling. A low mast was placed in the middle of the rowing vessel, a painted canvas sail was raised on it. Once sails were made of leather, the Egyptians sewed them from papyrus, and the Chinese still knit them from thin bamboo shingles, like weaving mats. Sails in those days played a supporting role and rose only with a fair wind. People have not yet been able to control the sails so as to walk with a head wind. The sailing equipment itself was also imperfect. So little attention was paid to the sail then. And why, if there were many slaves? You don't need to pay them for their work, but you can feed them any way you like, as long as they are alive. But, no matter how hard the rowers, driven by whips, tried to give the ship a speed of more than 6 to 7 knots, they did not succeed. A knot is a speed equal to 1 mile per hour, and 1 mile is 1.852 kilometers. To increase the speed of rowboats, they began to build them narrow and long. So later galleys appeared. They were especially built in the Middle Ages by Venice, which conducted extensive maritime trade. The masters of the famous Venetian arsenal became famous all over the world for the excellent quality of their galleys. Much of their structure was considered a state secret. About 16,000 people worked there, but no one gave out the secrets of their most skilled craftsmen, and they were threatened with the death penalty. The galleys were the highest achievement of the rowing fleet and were used mainly as warships guarding merchant ships. The oars were arranged in one tier, but they were still so long that they had to land 6 or even 7 rowers for each. Rowing ships began to be made with oars in several tiers. Their work was truly hard labor. By the way, once this expression was directly connected with rowing in galleys, because galleys in Russia were called penal servitude. That's where the word hard labor came from. These are the conditions under which the slave rowers worked. In the stern of the ship was the head of the rowers, or, as he was called, the committee. His 2 assistants, armed with whips, stood, one in the middle, and the other in the bow of the ship. Here the captain gave the command to the committee. He raised a silver whistle to his mouth. This signal was repeated by the assistants. The slaves, chained to their seats, twirled their oars. Dozens of oars seem to be one, so they rise and fall smoothly into the water to the beat of the drums. If any oar broke the friendly movements, its rowers received blows on the heads with the next oar. In addition, the blows of whips fell on the backs of these completely naked people. Their bodies convulsively bent towards the stern to stretch the oar over the backs of their comrades, squirming just like them. When the blade begins to sink into the water, the rowers press the oars with such zeal that they almost fall on the bench. It seems that a normal person cannot endure even an hour of such work. But the galleys worked for 12 hours or more without any rest. If someone fell from exhaustion, they threw him overboard. Section of a rowboat. Of course, one could not expect a good job from such a forced slave. And with the fall of slavery, rowboats became completely unprofitable. They became less and less. State criminals began to be sent to the galleys as a gratuitous force. There were not so many of them. I had to hire rowers. For 100 to 150 rowers and other crew members, it was necessary to take so much food and fresh water into the voyage that there was very little space left for the transported goods. And during the excitement, you can't row at all, you'll break the oars. We must wait. So, moving away from the shore was dangerous. Swimming costs are high, but there is little sense. Even in ancient times, people tried to replace rowers with bulls or horses. Of course, you will immediately say that you cannot force a horse to row with oars. For such a thing, perhaps, not a single trainer would undertake. Right. But people got out. Animal training was not required. They came up with another way. A round platform was arranged in the middle of the deck of the ship, and a gate was placed in the center of it. Drawbars were attached to the collar, and horses were harnessed to them and driven in a circle. The gate was connected with a special gear to a transverse shaft, on which paddle wheels were mounted on both sides of the vessel. They will hit the horses with whips, and they will run in a circle. The gate begins to rotate the wheels, and the ship moves. Here comes the command, "A stop!" Then the drovers shout with one voice, "A stop!" The horses are somehow restrained, and the ship finally comes to a halt. But the horses did not help the owners of the ships. Vessels moved no faster than at oars. And in stormy weather at sea, there was no harmony with the animals at all. They huddled together on the deck of a rocking ship, confused the harness. It was impossible to make them rotate the gate. The owner had only one thing to do, and to land on the shore and wait for good weather. Don't push yourself. In addition, the whole ship was cluttered with stalls and stuffed with hay. Cargo was taken very little. No, you can't get far on horseback either. Something more reliable than a paddle was needed. The long-known sails became such a means, the improvement of which provided the possibility of access to the ocean expanses. From then until the beginning of the 19th century, sailing ships became the only form of maritime transport, sailing across the ocean. In the Middle Ages, navigation took a big step forward. The search for sea routes to fabulous India and other richest countries of the East began. America was discovered at the end of the 15th century. Rich overseas lands attracted the greedy eyes of European colonialists. Trade between Europe and other parts of the world expanded more and more. Ships now had to cross oceans and cover distances of thousands of miles as quickly as possible. It is clear that rowing vessels were not suitable for long-distance voyages. Not a single convict will survive such a path. A few centuries before our era in Greece and Rome, they tried to build sailing ships that did not have oars at all. But they could only walk with a fair wind. If a headwind was blowing, the sail was removed, the ships lay in a drift, they were carried anywhere. Gradually, shipbuilders began to make some improvements, trying to make ships more reliable and seaworthy. The sides were made higher so that in case of sudden gusts of wind the ships would not capsize, draw water and would not be overwhelmed by the wave. For the same purpose, the hulls were made wider, fuller. And in order for the ship to carry less with a headwind, it received a deeper draft. Then they took up the sails, their number on one ship increased. Instead of one, they put 3 or even 4 sails. Instead of one mast, several appeared. The shape of the sail often changed from rectangular, straight sail, to triangular, oblique. These were much easier to manage. People gradually learned to wield them in such a way that ships began to sail even against the wind. True, it was necessary to maneuver, that is, to steer the ship in zigzags so that the wind did not blow directly into the bow of the ship, but at an acute angle to the direction of its movement. Of course, the speed with this method is much less than with a tailwind. But the ship still went where it was needed. So in the Middle Ages, large and seaworthy, reliable and roomy sailing ships appeared on the sea routes. The most common ships at that time were naves, Karachi and caravels. The naves appeared in the 13th century. Naves appeared in the 13th century. They were also called round, their overweight body seemed so pot-bellied. They marked the beginning of the transition from rowing ships to purely sailing ones. The largest naves were built in Venice and were up to 40 meters long. They had 2 masts, and each hoisted one triangular sail. Later naves had 3 or even 4 masts. Historians tell of one voyage of the French King Louis IX across the Mediterranean in the nave. The journey lasted over 10 weeks, and neither the king nor the 800 knights who accompanied him suffered any lack of provisions and fresh water. This shows that the naves were indeed large and spacious. The nave already had lifeboats, and the largest of them dragged behind the stern of the ship. They say that Louis IX put guilty knights in this boat. It must be assumed that the situation of these people, especially during the unrest, was not pleasant. Carracks began to be built in the 14th century in Genoa, Portugal, and later in France. These were large 3-masted ships with a carrying capacity of about 1,000 tons. They had 4 decks, and the height between the decks was such that a tall man walked freely in the premises, while on previous ships he would have had to bend down. In the 15th century, a new type of ocean sailing vessel appeared, the caravel. Caravels were strong and hardy ships. This ship became known throughout Europe after Christopher Columbus immortalized his name with the discovery of America. The Columbus flotilla consisted of 3 caravels. Until that time, small deckless ships were called that. Therefore, some historians were deeply mistaken, claiming that Columbus reached the shores of America on the shell. True, The length of his largest caravel, Santa Maria, was about 25 meters, and the small, Nina, only 18. But they were very light on the move and quite seaworthy deck ships with superstructures in the bow and especially at the stern. The superstructures housed the crew. These caravels were much stronger and more enduring than the largest naves and carracks, although they took much less cargo. When Columbus left the port of Palos on his historic voyage in the summer of 1492, there were 80 people on board his caravel Pinta and a huge supply of provisions, equipment and fresh water. And the whole caravel could take 120 tons of cargo. Columbus, describing the storm that caught him on his way back near the Azores, said that he got rid of death only thanks to the strong construction and good seaworthiness of his caravel. By the way, in 1892, when the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America was celebrated, the organizers of the celebrations came up with such a thing, and they decided to build a real caravel, similar in everything to the Columbus one, and on it to repeat exactly the historical flight of Columbus. So they did. And again they solemnly discovered America after the ocean crossing, which was completed quite safely. The only difference was that, just in case there was a huge steamer going by all the time. In the 18th century, England, the then mistress of the seas, came to the fore in the construction of sailing ships. This was greatly helped by the fact that the English ships were built from first-class Russian materials exported from Arkhangelsk. So, the British sewed sails from Russian canvas. The masts were made from trees grown in Russian pine forests. Gear was made from Russian hemp. When anchors and chains were forged, the ringing of Ural iron was heard. But how did the development of the Russian sailing fleet go? It dates back to the 11th to 12th centuries. Already the fleet of Novgorod the Great consisted of many sailing ships. In 1948, during excavations near Staraya Ladoga, the remains of an ancient ship were discovered. These remnants tell us about the high skill of Novgorod shipbuilders. On the ribs frames preserved from this nautical typesetting boat, traces of wooden nails are clearly visible. Back in the 12th century, Novgorodians made long voyages across the Baltic Sea, reaching the ports of Sweden and Denmark. In Russian epics, there are references to the time when, on their buses ships, merchants, guests of Novgorod, and their brave squads walked along the Blue Sea Varangian, walked along the Volga and ran along the Khvalinsky Sea, Caspian Sea. Novgorodians even reached the White Sea and here, on the coast, founded several settlements. The Tatar-Mongol invasion, and then the Swedish-German invasion in the northwest, deprived Rus of access to the seas. The development of the Russian fleet was interrupted for several centuries. Navigation at that time developed only in the north of our country. The descendants of the Novgorodians, the Pomus, felt at home on the icy sea. Moreover, they went to hunt for animals and fish all the way to Novaya Zemlya and even penetrated into the Kara Sea. Before foreign sailors, they visited Grumant, as the island of Svalbard was then called. Pomus built wonderful sea vessels. Fearless explorers went out on light deckless ears. And a little later, the already familiar single-masted Korchi appeared. They were flat-bottomed, single-deck vessels about 20 meters long, with a strong hull adapted for navigation among ice. Most often, Korchi sailed. A quadrangular sail was sewn from skins for a long time, tackle was belt. To build such a vessel, skilled sailors did not need a single iron part. They say that even anchors were made from driftwood, tying a heavier stone to it. Of course, over time, the cock changed, iron fasteners appeared. Pomus also built three-masted sailing ships, seaboats that lifted up to 200 tons of cargo. Sailing on such ships, Russian sailors at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th centuries discovered the northern and eastern shores of Asia to the world. And the navigator Semyon Dezhnev was the first in 1648 to pass between Asia and North America. By this he proved that there was a strait between the two continents. But the scientists of Western Europe believed then that Asia and America are parts of the same continent. In the 17th century, the construction of separate large-sized sailing ships in an overseas style began. The first such vessel, the three-masted, still flat-bottomed Friedrich, was built as early as 1635 in Nizhny Novgorod. It was intended for trade with Persia. His fate was sad. In the same year, he crashed on pitfalls near the Caucasian coast. The second attempt to create a fleet of large sea vessels was made under Alexei Mikhailovich on the Volga, in the village of Dedanovo. A large three-masted ship, Eagle, was built here. He also suffered a sad fate, as the troops of Stepan Razin took Astrakhan and burned the Eagle standing there. Only under Peter I did the creation of a strong navy begin. There is a small boat in the hall of the Central Naval Museum. This ship played a very important role in the life of Peter I and in the history of the Russian fleet. It is not for nothing that this old-fashioned ship is respectfully called the grandfather of the Russian fleet. Riding along the Yser on this boat, young Peter caught fire with a passion for the sea and maritime business. The banks of the river seemed narrow. He transferred the boat to Pereyaslavolskoye, Pleshcheyevo Lake, built several dozen more boats there and carried out whole sea battles with his amusing flotilla. These games of the young king became the harbingers of a great deed. Such a deed was the creation in our country of a military and merchant fleet and the conquest of access to the sea. Russia took an honorable place among the great maritime powers. During the reign of Peter I, a strong battle fleet was created, consisting of 48 powerful battleships and frigates, 790 galleys and other sailing and rowing vessels. The American maritime historian Mahan called it a unique historical miracle. Great attention was paid by Peter I to the development of the merchant fleet and shipping. He visited Arkhangelsk 3 times, sailed the White Sea, visited the shipyard of the Bazinin brothers on the Vavchuga River. Large merchant ships were built at this shipyard. In 1703, the first ship of this kind, St. Andrew I called, set sail with Russian goods for England and Holland. And in the same year, the first foreign ship came to St. Petersburg. And in the last year of Peter's life, more than 900 ships visited the port of the young capital. The rapidly growing Russian fleet required many sailors and shipbuilders. Peter I sent a large group of young people abroad to teach them maritime affairs. He himself worked for over 4 months as a carpenter at a shipyard in Amsterdam and studied the theory of shipbuilding under the guidance of the best craftsmen in Holland and England. In Moscow, the School of Mathematical and Navigational Sciences was established in 1701, and the Naval Academy was opened in St. Petersburg in 1716. Under Peter I, about 20 textbooks on navigation and shipbuilding were first published. Peter I cared a lot about improving the ships under construction. The successors of Peter I paid little attention to the development of the fleet, and the construction of ships was greatly reduced. Only under Catherine II did shipbuilding temporarily regain its former scope. There are many names of talented Russian shipbuilders. True, most of them had to build mainly warships, but many of them distinguished themselves in the construction of merchant ships. So, when ordering ships at the Vavchug shipyard, the British and Dutch specially paid a lot of money for Stepan Konev himself to build them. Self-taught, a friend of Lomonosov, Stepan Konev became famous for his strong and with special art construction of large seaworthy ships. The Arkhangelsk master M.D. Portnov built 63 ships in 23 years of work. A.M. Korochkin also worked in Arkhangelsk at the beginning of the 19th century. He created such strong and beautiful ship hulls that the government ordered to engrave, for the edification of posterity, a drawing of this hull on copper, in order to keep it unchanged in the future. Korochkin's contemporary, Ivan Afanasiev, was famous for his work on the Black Sea. During his life, he built 38 large and many small combat and merchant ships. Russian battleship of the time of Peter the Great, Poltava. The Russian flag began to appear in the most remote and still little-known corners of the globe. The merits of Russian sailors are great. In the 18th century they explored the shores of Northwest America. In the 19th century, they made 42 circumnavigations around the world, during which important geographical discoveries were made. A lot of work was put into the discovery and study of the shores of the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic by such famous navigators as Bering, Chirikov, Golovnin, Nevelskoy, Krusenstern, Litke, Malagin and others. With their wonderful campaigns, they forever glorified our motherland. This is how the sailing ship was arranged, the Russian sloop Vostok. 1. Yards, 2. Platforms, sailings, 3. Topmasts, 4. Side guys, 5. Nasal braces, stays, 6. Anchor, 7. Rosters, a place for boats and spare parts for masts, 8. Spire, gate for lifting the anchor, 9. Steering wheel, 10. Boat, 11. Kitchen, galley, 12. Lower deck, 13. Gunner's cabin, 14. Wardroom, 15. Captain's cabin, 16. Skipper's pantry, 17. Spare sails and gear, 18. Pumps for pumping water, 19. Stock of provisions, 20. Tiller, 21. Powder cellar, cruet camera, 22. Firewood, 23. Water supply, 24. Spare anchor, 25. Stock of wine and provisions, 26. Captain's cellar, 27. Stock of crackers, 28. Ballast. The names of the masts and sails are given in the figure. In 1819 to 1821, officers of the Russian fleet F.F. Bellingshausen and M.P. Lazarev discovered a new continent, Antarctica, on the sailing sloops Vostok and Mirny. Prior to this, some believed that there was a mainland in the southern hemisphere, while others believed that there was no mainland there, but only ice. Many researchers unsuccessfully tried to solve this riddle. The most stubborn of them was the famous English sailor, Captain James Cook. He spent many years looking for Antarctica and finally declared that Antarctica either does not exist at all, or it is impossible to reach it. Russian sailors went around the South Polar continent. The risk associated with sailing in these unexplored, ice-covered seas in search of the southern mainland is so great, Cook said, that I can safely say that no person will ever dare to penetrate further south than I did. Russian sailors, on the other hand, not only reached Antarctica, but also circumnavigated the mysterious South Polar continent. As you can see, sailing ships have brought a lot of benefits. In the first half of the 19th century, they reached great perfection. Significantly increased their size and speed. Large 3- and 4-masted ships, barges, plied the ocean expanses. Finally, the fastest 3-masted sailing ships, clippers, go to sea to transport especially urgent cargo, such as tea and gold. Clipper, wind squeezer. Clippers were made with a narrow, pointed hull, and as many sails were raised on the masts as they could not previously put on 2 ships of this size. They began to be called squeezers of the winds. Their speed reached 18 knots. And the English clipper, Jem Baines, showed a record speed of 21 knots. Today, this speed is not yet available to all passenger ships. Sailboats began to lift up to 1,500 tons of cargo, but, going under full sail on a strong wave, the hulls of large ships experienced great stress. It was impossible to make wooden cases even stronger, they turned out to be very heavy anyway. Then the sides of the ships began to be pulled together with iron rods, and then they completely abandoned the wooden ribs of the ship's skeleton. The set began to be assembled from iron ribs, and only the skin, decks and superstructures remained wooden. To increase the strength of the bottom of the vessel and protect it from destruction by woodworms, copper sheets began to be applied to the skin. So the ship gradually turned from wood to metal. Schooners with slanting sails appeared. It is easy and convenient to remove such sails directly from the deck and there is no need to climb the masts. Therefore, the number of sailors on the schooners decreased. Many improvements were also made in the design of ships. We started to carry out ventilation and install stove heating. Portholes were cut through to bring natural light into the premises. Heavy brick galleys were replaced with light ones made of iron. Instead of hemp anchor ropes, iron chains began to be used. But the rapid development of capitalism required the expansion of ties between parts of the world, the great speed of transporting a huge number of goods and passengers across the oceans. Wooden sailing ships could no longer satisfy such requirements. And mainly because sailing on them was entirely dependent on the wind. There is wind, the ship is moving. There is no wind, no one to blow the sails, the ship is motionless. At least attach the oars to its side. Yes, such a colossus cannot be moved by any oars. It was no better in strong winds when a storm broke out. It was necessary to urgently remove the sails, otherwise the ship could capsize from the powerful pressure of the wind, and in any case it would have been left without masts. And then you had to rely on the will of the waves and the wind, where they will take you. From such unexpected vagaries of the weather, the ship lost a lot of time, and the passengers got big miscalculations. Let's say a passenger expects to get from Europe to America in 40 days, but will get there in 60 days. And at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a transition from a wooden ship hull to an iron one and from sails to a mechanical engine. It was a fundamental revolution in the history of navigation and shipbuilding. And it became possible only after a reliable steam engine was born. How did the steamboat come about? On November 3, 1815, a crowd of thousands of residents of St. Petersburg gathered on the Never embankment. People watched with interest as some strange ship moved along the river. Outwardly, it resembled a wooden barge, on which firewood was usually transported. But one structure on the ship confused everyone. None of those gathered could explain why a tall brick chimney was installed on the deck, from which smoke was pouring thickly. If this is the chimney of the ship's kitchen, the galley, then why is it so huge? There was another feature on the ship, from each side, clumsy wheels, like those of a watermill, rose above the deck. The wheels turned and the ship moved. Moreover, how it moved, acquired quickly both with the flow and against the flow of the river, although it did not have sails. People were amazed. What a wonderful marvel! The vessel moves without sails and in any direction. It even went to the sea bay. And why it moves like that is unknown. The audience witnessed a historic event, the launch of the first Russian steamship Elizaveta. The steamer Elizaveta headed for the bay. Petersburg newspapers in every way admired the outlandish vessel. And the magazine Son of the Fatherland published its full description, from which we learn that Elizabeth, without current and wind, goes 10 miles per hour, and to set the machine in motion, with a capacity of 4 horsepower, it was 1 sazhen of birch single-field firewood was used up, and a lot of coal as well. By the way, everything was adapted to the fact that on a high chimney, in which case, it was possible to raise the sail. So they didn't really trust the car. In general, people are not yet accustomed to steam, although people have been trying to use its power to move mechanisms for 2 millennia. Heron of Alexandria was the first to try to do this, back in the 2nd century BC. The story tells that Heron built the Eolipile mechanism, rotated by the reactive power of steam jets. Later, other inventors tried to build steam mechanisms, but they, like Heron, managed to create only funny toys. It was necessary to work a lot on these toy engines to put them into action. And the weak technology of those times did not give such an opportunity, and therefore they remained useless. Only at the beginning of the 18th century did the first steam engines appear. These fire-acting machines themselves did not set the plant in motion, but only poured water from mines, docks, or supplied it to the place where ores were processed. In fact, these were not steam engines, but water-lifting pumps. The main driving force at that time were water wheels. Rotating from the gravity of the falling water, the wheels set in motion machine tools, bellows for artificially blowing air into melting furnaces, blacksmith hammers and other mechanisms, and everything depended on water. There is water, the factory settings are working. There is no water, they are inactive, and we must return to the old way, to turn the wheels with horses. Here are the cars that were at the time when Ivan Polzunov began his career at a factory in Yekaterinburg, now Sverdlovsk. 19 years earlier than the Englishman James Watt, he managed to build the world's first operating factory steam engine, which, according to our will, it can do whatever it takes. Polzunov's car. It was a steam engine with 2 cylinders. Steam was supplied to the cylinders through pipes from a boiler made of copper sheets. The cylinders had a special device that directed steam to one or the other cylinder, in turn. And the pistons in the cylinders moved alternately, and the pistons, in turn, forced to act a rocker connected to the bellows for blowing air into the melting furnaces. Polzunov tried to ensure that all parts of his machine worked continuously, automatically, so that these parts, as he said, keep themselves in motion. In 1763, Polzunov completed the development of the draft of his car and submitted it to the head of the mining department, General Poroshin. The general praised the project and immediately sent it to St. Petersburg for approval. Polzunov's joy knew no end. But this joy was premature. Big trouble lay ahead of him. The project came to the president of the mining board, Schluter. Reluctantly, he wrote on the project that this fiction for a new invention should be honored. But he immediately added a few phrases from which one could understand that Polzunov, they say, stole someone else's invention. And in the project itself, Schluter made such changes that only worsened the quality of the car. The remarkable project of Polzunov was reported to Empress Catherine II. And so, by royal decree, Polzunov was awarded the title of mechanic and promised 400 rubles of a bonus, and General Poroshin was ordered to immediately begin construction. As soon as the construction of the car began, surprises rained down on Polzunov. Polzunov had his own, thoroughly thought-out, construction plan. At first he wanted to make an experimental model of the machine, and after eliminating all the shortcomings in the model, to start building the machine itself. During this time, which would go to making the model and testing it, Polzunov dreamed of training experienced builders from workers. But the intrigues of envious foreigners turned the whole thing in a different way. Polzunov was told, and no models and experiments. We need to build a real car. And for the work they allocated to him those who do not know, but only have one inclination to do so, 2 artisans and a few more simple peasants. And the machine required a long and painstaking work of many skilled people. It was a colossus 11 meters high. Some cylinders were about 3 meters high. Separate parts of the machine weighed up to 3 tons. The more obstacles grew in front of Polzunov. But he overcame them with rare courage and steadfastness. He made tools for making and assembling machine parts. He created new machines for turning. Things got to the point that Polzunov spent most of his meager salary on the construction of the car. But the promised prize did not come from St. Petersburg. At times, Polzunov felt a terrible despair. And only the friendly support of ordinary workers added to his strength. They secretly from the authorities helped Polzunov to manufacture parts of the machine. They took care of his health. By the end of 1765 the car was ready. But it was impossible to start testing it until the blower itself was completed. And while he was finishing, Polzunov fell ill with transient consumption and died in May 1766. The great inventor never had to see his brainchild in action. The machine started working 3 months after Polzunov's death, but foreign businessmen needed the Russian invention to cease to exist. The car was abandoned after the first minor breakdown, and it did not work anymore. For 12 years the car stood idle. Then came the order of the managers of the factories, the fire engine, to dismantle, break the factory located at it and use the forest for whatever it is good for. Thus ended the existence of the world's first steam engine. The great creation of Polzunov was forgotten for a long time. The championship in the invention of such a machine was attributed to the Englishman Watt. Be that as it may, but thanks to the steam engine, ships received a reliable means for fast movement, a mechanical engine, and began to be called steamships. A lot of time passed before the steam engine found its place on the ship. She has many opponents. What absurd arguments they brought against the installation of a steam engine on ships. For example, they argued that the steam engine would often fail, that it would require exorbitant fuel consumption and that there could be fires. But life refuted all these fears, and the 19th century at sea became the golden age of steamships. Of course, even before the advent of the Elizabeth there were many attempts to build a steamship. Back in 1543, a cunning Spanish sailor, Blasco de Garay, proposed to Emperor Charles V to build a ship that could sail against the wind without any sails or oars. The emperor did not believe it, but for the sake of curiosity he ordered such a vessel to be built. After some time, the sailor announced that the 200-ton Trinidad was ready, and the emperor himself decided to see what came of this venture. To avoid suspicion of dealing with the devil, and the inquisitors did not like to joke, Garay filled the cauldron with holy water from a nearby monastery. Soon, from a boiler placed somewhere in the middle of the ship, smoke poured through the chimney, mysterious mechanisms started working, paddle wheels began to move, and the Trinidad went. Everyone was amazed. The inventor was generously rewarded, but he still did not reveal his secret and disappeared. And much later, the researchers proved that the wheels were turned not by steam, but by people hidden in the hold. In 1675, one idle inventor, Miller, put a windmill on the deck of the ship. According to Miller's plan, she was supposed to set the ship's paddle wheels in motion with an endless cable. However, nothing came of this venture. They tell about a rich eccentric who arranged a huge bellows on his yacht. This fur was supposed to blow into the sails during a calm at sea and move the ship forward. Of course it didn't budge. A more successful ship with a mechanical engine was created in 1736 by the inventor Gulls. Behind the stern of this vessel, a wheel was strengthened, which was set in motion by a system of endless belts thrown over pulleys. And the pulleys were rotated by a steam mechanism. But even this ship did not have to become the first steamship. The mechanism often failed and it was eventually adapted for extracting iron in a nearby mine. Many inventors tried to install a steam engine on a ship. The most successful steamboat, though for navigation on the river, was created by the American Robert Fulton. Fulton's life was very interesting. It is difficult to answer the question of what profession Fulton had. He worked as a mechanic and painter, watchmaker and road builder, hydraulic engineer and jeweler. But since childhood, he was most fond of mechanics. All his days he was engaged in the fact that he made intricate designs from iron fragments and pieces of wire. And when it still bothered, he took up another favorite pastime, drawing. Love for painting takes over for a while. And Fulton, at the age of 16, moves from America to England. In London, he persistently improved in painting. His teacher is pleased, a brilliant path to the glory of the artist opens before a talented student. But Fulton himself does not feel any signs of real talent in his paintings. He understands that he is not destined to become an outstanding artist, and abruptly changes his profession. Fulton enters as simple worker at a mechanical plant. Here, in the workshop, among the hum of machine tools and the grinding of bench saws, Fulton finally finds his calling. This calling is invention. Fulton has been working at factories in England for 3 years, carefully studying their equipment, improving various machines and making valuable suggestions. At the same time, he invents a machine for sawing and polishing marble, a machine for making ropes, a machine for yarn of flax and hemp, develops a new system of locks and channels, and invents a submarine. And in 1803 he built the world's first river steamboat in Paris. The car for his ship was made in England. But, as soon as it was put on the ship, the wooden bottom could not withstand the great weight and was pressed through. Fulton stopped working on this steamer and returned to his homeland. Here, on the Hudson River, in 1807 he built a more successful, first real steamboat, the Clermont. The first steamboat, the Clermont. This steamer, about 40 meters long, sailed between New York and the city of Albany for several years, carrying cargo and passengers. After Clermont and Elizabeth, river and sea steamers began to be built in all countries. Of course, the first machines installed on steamboats were imperfect and underpowered. The most powerful ship engine was then a steam engine of 20 horsepower. The power of a steam piston engine in modern steamships reaches 5,000 horsepower. What are these horsepower and why are they used to measure the power of a car? Of course, there are no horses in the car. The pistons are driven by steam. What's the matter? The fact is that power is measured by the amount of work that is done in 1 second. A unit of work is taken as the work that is performed when moving 1 kilogram by 1 meter. It is called the kilogram meter. Thus, the power of a machine can be measured in kilogram meters of work performed per second. But usually the power of the machine is measured in horsepower. As we already know, the first steam engines were adapted to lift water. Previously, this work was done by horses. When ordering steam engines, it was required to indicate what kind of performance or power they should have. But people are accustomed to horses, so when ordering a steam engine, they indicated how many horses it should replace. Then they calculated that a strong horse, on average, performs work per second, corresponding to lifting 75 kilograms per meter. This performance of the horse was taken as a unit when measuring the power of machines. And this unit was called horsepower. If they say that the machine develops a power of 20 horsepower, then it can do work of 1,500 kilogram meters per second. Now the steamer's powerful piston engine does the work of 5,000 horses. Imagine now that the history of technology froze at the time when the gate of the ship, connected to the wheels, was actually rotated by horses. It is hard to imagine a ship on which 5,000 horses work at once. And how much more hay and oats will they need? It turns out not a ship, but a stable of extraordinary size. Where is there to take passengers and cargo, when there is nowhere to put the horses? With the development of mechanical engineering, it was possible to build machines of greater and greater power, without a significant increase in their size. A modern ship's high-power steam engine, together with boilers and fuel reserves, occupies no more than a quarter of the length of the steamer, or even less. She has 3, and sometimes 4 cylinders. The car has 3 or even 4 cylinders. Why does a steam engine need so many cylinders? After all, the machines of the first steamers had only 1 cylinder. It turns out that in a single-cylinder machine it is impossible to fully use all the energy of steam. Steam left this machine with such energy, which would be enough for more work. And for the machine to work well, it is necessary that the pressure of the steam leaving the cylinder be as low as possible. But for such a steam, a large volume of the cylinder is needed. After all, the steam expands greatly. So this cylinder must be huge. That is why the first ship machines were not very productive, bulky and heavy. They required a lot of steam for their work, and hence a high fuel consumption. The steamships of that time looked more like coal depots than cargo ships. The stock of coal on them often exceeded the amount of cargo carried in the holds. With such machines, shipping could not develop. Then they decided to use multi-cylinder machines, in which the steam would expand in turn in cylinders of ever larger diameter, since each cylinder was larger than the previous one. After each transition from one cylinder to another, the steam could expand, giving some of its energy to the movement of the piston. So the steam gradually lost its elasticity, doing useful work in each cylinder. Such economical machines have come to be called double or triple expansion machines, depending on how many cylinders the steam is running. In triple expansion machines, the smallest cylinder, where the steam enters first, is called the high-pressure cylinder, then the steam passes into the medium-pressure cylinder and, finally, into the largest, the low-pressure cylinder. But, in addition to improving the machine itself, a lot of work had to be done on the arrangement of boilers that produce steam. Steamship energy. Let's see how steam is produced in the boiler. The cauldron is a large steel drum resting on a solid foundation. Of course, it does not look like those cauldrons in which food is boiled, just because the fire is made not outside, but inside it, in furnaces. If you compare it, it is better with a samovar. Only, in addition to the flame tube, the ship's boiler has a lot of tubes inside. They are called smokers. Hot gases pass through them from the furnace and firebox. Then these gases go into the chimney of the steamer. Water fills the boiler body over the tubes. But at the top there is still space where the steam collects. And steam is obtained from the evaporation of water heated by hot pipes and walls of furnaces. Such a boiler is called a fire tube. Fire tube boiler. 1. Boiler drum. 2. Firebox. 3. Smoke tubes. 4. Firebox. 5. Smoke box. 6. Sukoparnik. 7. Steam space. 8. Steam outlet to the machine. There are also water tube boilers. They have the opposite, water goes through the tubes, and hot gases heat the tubes from the outside. And outwardly, these boilers do not look like fire tubes. They have 2 or even 3 drums, although they are small in size. These drums, collectors, most often have a triangle, 1 upper, steam and water, and 2 lower, water. The word collector means a collector. It was not used here by accident. The upper collector is connected to the lower 2 bundles of hot water tubes. Between the bundles there is a firebox lined with refractory bricks. Water fills the lower collectors, all the pipes and even half of the upper one. And steam is collected in its free upper half. Water tube boilers are much better than fire tube boilers. They are not as heavy or bulky. They require much less water. Therefore, if for the wiring of a fire tube boiler it is necessary to spend at least 12 hours, then the wiring of a water tube boiler takes place 4 to 5 times faster. A steam engine with a capacity of 5,000 horsepower can be served by 1 water tube boiler, while 4 or even 5 fire tube boilers would have to be installed. It means a lot for the operation of the boiler, what kind of fuel is burned in it. Previously, only hard coal served as fuel for ship boilers. For him, coal pits were blocked off on the sides of the stokers, and sometimes between them. Coal was poured into these bunker pits through openings in the upper deck. Coal is thrown through the doors of the fireboxes in even layers onto the grate of the boiler, like the one in the kitchen stove. Below the grate is an ash pan for collecting ashes. During the combustion of coal, hot gases are formed, which penetrate through the firebox into the fire tubes. But not all the energy contained in the coal is converted into steam energy. The fact is that coal does not burn completely, some part of it flies out into the chimney. That's why she smokes. A lot of heat is carried away into the chimney by the combustion products of coal. They leave the boiler with temperatures up to 400 degrees. People have now thought of using the heat of the exhaust gases to heat the water that feeds the boiler. Hot gases, before escaping into the air, are passed through a special chamber, an economizer, with several bundles of tubes. It is through these tubes, washed with hot gases, that the feed water is driven by a pump. And water, already heated to 100 degrees and above, enters the boiler. And in order to evaporate the heated water, less heat is required, which is why the economy in fuel consumption is obtained. To do this, the exhaust gases also heat the air that is fed into the furnace. The boiler has another device. It serves to superheat the steam, and that's what it is called, a superheater. It turns out that steam during its formation carries water particles up. And this moisture in the steam impairs the performance of the machine. But superheated steam does not have such moisture, and its heat content is greater. This is not surprising. The temperature of superheated steam reaches 450 degrees. It is also necessary to tell about the fact that even after the steam has worked in all 3 cylinders of the car, its adventures do not end. Once upon a time, steam on ships was released directly into the air. Now they don't do that. From the machine, steam is sent to a special tank, a condenser. Inside this condenser there are many brass tubes, and through the tubes the pump continuously drives cold water from behind the side. Steam, touching the cold tubes, cools and turns into water, condensate. The feed pump drives this water to the boiler, where it becomes steam again. Of course, there will be some steam losses on the way from the boiler to the condenser. And each time less water enters the condenser than is supplied to the boiler. Well, in this case, the steamer always has a supply of fresh water to add to the boiler. Such stock is stored in special tanks, and if you release steam into the air, then you will not get enough water. Here you will need such a supply that even half a steamer will not be enough for him. Then not a steamboat, but some kind of water carrier will turn out. Where is there to think about cargo? Just right, to carry water. You may ask, why carry water when there is a whole sea around the ship? Pump yourself water into the cauldron from behind the side, and throw the steam into the air. But you can't do this, you'll only cause trouble for the steamer. When sea water begins to turn into steam, salt will settle on the walls of the boiler, scale. This scale gradually forms the second wall of the boiler. It will turn out, as it were, a lining inside a steel boiler. The steel wall, protected from water by scale, will overheat to the temperature in the furnace. From such heat, the strength of the steel wall decreases. It can stretch and burst and water will pour into the burning furnace. At the same time, so much steam will instantly turn out that any strong walls will not bother him. Like a shell, the cauldron will burst, smash the deck to smithereens. The whole ship may not survive from such an explosion. Therefore, no one pumps water into the boiler from overboard, but they carry fresh water with them, and they also use a condenser. On long-distance ships there is a special apparatus, a distiller, which turns salt water into fresh water, for feeding boilers and washing people. The capacitor has another important duty that improves the performance of the machine. It is known that water occupies a much smaller volume than steam. Therefore, when liquefying steam in a condenser, a rarefaction of space is obtained, a vacuum. The vacuum is further increased by pumping water and air out of the condenser. And in the cylinder of the machine, one can observe the following phenomenon: the steam pushes the piston on one side, and the vacuum of the condenser, increasing the difference in pressure on both sides of the piston, seems to help the steam on the other side. Of course, all this was not invented at once. For decades, engineers from all over the world have been improving the design of the boiler. Now ships' boilers are most often adapted to work not on coal, but on oil, or rather, on fuel oil, which is its remnants after processing. To burn fuel oil in a furnace, it is sprayed with a special device, a nozzle, first created by the famous inventor Alexander Ilyich Shpakovsky. The nozzle sprays the fuel oil supplied through the pipe and throws it out of the nozzle. The flame of burning fuel oil is like a whisk, and the temperature reaches 1600 degrees. With such a flame, less unburned fuel, soot and sparks are obtained than with coal heating. And the temperature of the flame is much higher than when burning coal. This means that the dimensions of the firebox can be made smaller. And what is important, the use of fuel oil reduced the number of stokers and facilitated their work. On watch at the boilers, there are no longer stokers covered with sweat and coal dust, who were once exhausted from the terrible heat, wielding crowbars and shurovkas weighing 20 to 30 kilograms in the furnaces. For one watch, sometimes everyone had to throw 2 to 3 tons of coal into the furnace. Water tube boiler with oil heating. 1. Upper drum, steam water collector, 2 and 4, hot water tubes, 3, lower drum, water collector, 5, economizer, 6, nozzle, 7, firebox, 8, main steam pipeline, 9, fuel filter, 10, fuel heater, 11, fuel pump, 12, double bottom oil tank, 13, turbofan, 14, chimney. In the department where oil boilers are located, this is how oil-fired boilers are called, there is neither terrible heat nor coal dust. Here, the stoker does not require great physical strength. Each boiler has many valves, taps and appliances. The stoker only monitors the readings of the instruments and, in accordance with them, adjusts the operation of the boiler. Often the boiler has automatic appliances. Then the machines do everything for a person, and they supply water, fuel oil, air in a strict ratio and precisely regulate the steam pressure, engine and propulsion. Now let's move on to the engine room of the ship. The cylinders of the machine rest on massive columns fastened to the foundation frame. Long rods pass through the bottom of the cylinders. A piston is mounted on the top of each rod. And the lower part of the rod ends with a cross member with a slider. The slider slides up and down the polished surfaces of the parallels mounted on the column of the machine. Parallels are to the motion of a piston what rails are to a tram car. They protect the stem from bending. The crossbar is connected to the next rod, which is called the connecting rod. The connecting rod is designed so that its upper part goes up and down along with the slider and rod, and the lower part rotates, like a bicycle pedal foot, one of the crankshaft knees of the machine. Thus, the rectilinear return movement of the piston in the cylinder is converted into a rotational movement of the crankshaft. And interestingly, the rotation of the crankshaft with the help of a special transmission mechanism, an eccentric, alternately inlets steam into the upper and lower cavity of each cylinder through a special spool box located next to the cylinder. Here we have the opposite phenomenon. The rotational movement of the shaft is converted by eccentrics into a rectilinear return movement of the box valves, called spools. The spools open windows either in the upper or in the lower cavity of the cylinder, letting in steam there. Steam from the boiler is supplied through the pipe through the spool boxes to the high-pressure cylinder, then, sequentially, to the medium and low-pressure cylinders, and from the low-pressure cylinder it is already discharged to the condenser. The crankshaft of the machine is connected to a whole line of shafts. This line stretches along a special tunnel, sometimes through several compartments of the ship, and ends with a propeller shaft that goes out from the stern of the ship. A propeller is mounted on this shaft. So the movement of the pistons of the cylinders causes the crankshaft of the machines, the ship's shafting and the propeller to rotate. Steam engine with triple steam expansion. 1. High pressure cylinder. 2. Medium pressure cylinder. 8. Low pressure cylinder. 4. Spool boxes. 5. Steam supply. 6. Piston. 7. Steam outlet to the condenser. 8. Stock. 9. Parallels. 10. Connecting rod. 11. Crankshaft. The first steamships did not yet have propellers. There were paddle wheels. The wheels are convenient on the river, where it is shallow and there are no big waves. And now there are still many river steamers with wheels. On the sea with paddle wheels, just a disaster, especially when the waves clear up. The ship is listing to starboard. The wheel of this board is deeply buried in the water, and the left one is exposed. At this point, the operation of the left wheel is useless. It flaps its blades in the air, and there is no use for the steamer. The ship will roll over to the port side, the right wheel spins in vain. And if so, then the machine is running unevenly. One wheel is overstressed, the other is idling. From such work, parts of the machines quickly wore out, became out of order, and the wheel blades broke. So it was until the screw was installed on the steamer. The useful action of the screw was known in ancient times. In those days, it was used to pump out water. They say that back in 1630, a model of a propeller designed to propel a ship was brought from China to Europe. But in the era of the sailing fleet, there were no machines that could rotate such a propeller, and only with the advent of a mechanical engine, they began to create and apply more and more successful designs of propellers. A very interesting screw was proposed by the Czech inventor Josef Ressel in 1827. His screw in the USA and Austria was recognized as quite suitable for the movement of the steamer. For the creation of the propeller, Ressel was even given a monument in Vienna and New York. An unusual incident happened to another inventor, the Englishman Smith. In 1836 he tested a ship that had a long wooden screw of Archimedes. In an accidental accident, part of the propeller was broken off, but the ship went much faster. It turns out that the screw got a more favorable shape. In our country, the first screw steamer was the frigate Archimedes, built in 1848. The rivalry between the propeller and the wheel dragged on for a long time. And sometimes it was necessary to put both the propeller and the wheel at the same time. So, on the giant Great Eastern ship built in the 60s, it was about 200 meters long. The builders piled both wheels, 17 meters in diameter, and a propeller, weighing about 36 tons, and even 6 masts with sails. In 1842, in order to finally decide which propulsion is better, they did this, and they took 2 completely identical frigates with identical machines, 200 forces each, but one was made screw and the other wheeled. Then they installed them stern to each other, connected with strong chains, and gave full speed ahead to both ships. The screw pulled and dragged the opponent at a speed of 2.5 knots. The propeller and paddle wheels are called ship propellers. By the way, many people confuse the engine with the mover. They think they are one and the same. In fact, these concepts are different. The engine is a machine that creates the force necessary for the movement of the ship. But by itself, such a force cannot move the ship. An additional device is required, with the help of which the force of the machine will act on the water, repel the vessel from it. This device is the mover. There are many different types of propellers, but the most common is so far the propeller. It consists of 3 or 4 blades and a common sleeve, the hub, which is mounted on the propeller shaft. Vessels most often have 1 or 2 propellers and the same number of machines. The propeller consists of 3 or 4 blades and a hub. How does a propeller work? At the paddle steamer you can see what and how it rows. It has wheels along the sides, mounted on the shaft of a machine running across the vessel. With the blades of its wheels, the steamer rakes in the water, as if with oars. And at the screw you see behind the stern only a powerful stream of seething water. This is a propeller sitting deep in the water, rotating, screwing into it, pushing the water back with force, and the ship moves forward. This force, the propeller stop, is transmitted to the entire ship through a special thrust bearing on the shaft. Properly selected dimensions and shape of its blades mean a lot for the normal operation of the propeller. This is what happened to our outstanding shipbuilder, academician A.N. Krylov. One day he was sailing on a new English ship. The captain of this ship was gloomy and very reluctant to answer all of Krylov's questions. Apparently, he was dissatisfied with something. In the end, we managed to find out the reason for the bad mood of the captain. It turns out that he was annoyed by the low speed of the ship. "You understand," the captain said angrily, "how unpleasant it is to go at the speed of a turtle on a ship that, according to all its data, should be fast. What's the matter here? I'll never know." Krylov listened sympathetically to the captain. He understood the sadness of the old sailor. And he decided to help him. When the ship arrived in England, Krylov went to the office of the society that owned the ship, and saw a model of the ill-fated ship there. The model exactly reproduced the entire device of the ship, but, of course, with a decrease, 100 times. It immediately caught Krylov's eye that the propeller on the ship was unreasonably large. He recommended that the owner of the ship cut each propeller blade by 200 millimeters. The ship owner obeyed and then did not regret that he trusted the Russian scientist. It was worth reducing the propeller blades, and the steamer began to give speed a few knots more. It turns out that the diameter of the screw was chosen incorrectly. "How could you so skillfully determine the illness of my ship?" asked the astonished shipowner. "I have been reading the theory of the ship for 32 years at the Naval Academy in Leningrad." Krylov answered simply, "Designers work hard to improve the operation of the screw and thereby increase the speed of the steamer without increasing the power of the engine. They are also trying to create such ships where you can do without propellers, wheels and even without rudders. This is the picture that could be observed once on the Man River, south of Krasnoyarsk." The silence of the river was broken by the roar of an engine. A small boat appeared around the corner. Suddenly, an obstacle blocked his way, a heap of logs. But the boat did not stop and did not turn. Squeezing the logs under him at full speed, he entered the very thick of the jam. The boat entered the thick of the jam. Under such conditions of navigation, any ship would have shattered the propeller to smithereens and it would have lost all ability to move and be controlled. But the fact of the matter is that the boat did not have a propeller. He did not have a car with shafts and a steering wheel. Instead of all this, the boat had only a powerful pump. This pump draws in water through the intake holes in the bottom, and then with great force pushes it through the stern, and the boat gets forward. Such an installation is called a jet or jet. Designers also create such devices that help small cruise ships develop unusually high speed. Such devices include, for example, hydrofoils. The boat rocket has already been built at the Krasnoye Samuvo plant in Gorky. It has 2 supporting wings under the hull. At low speed, such a boat moves like a conventional ship. But here the speed of the boat increases to 30 km per hour. It would seem that more speed cannot be squeezed out of this propeller. But this is where hydrofoils come into play. They, like the wings of an airplane, create lift and push the hull of the boat out of the water. It seems to float above the surface of the water. Only the wings, propeller and rudder remain submerged in water. Thanks to this, the resistance of water to the movement of the boat decreases sharply, and its speed increases with fabulous speed, 60, 80, 100 km per hour. The boat rushes along the picturesque shores. The winged boat speeds past. Engineers consider it acceptable to create marine vessels with hydrofoils. Perhaps several years will pass, and passenger express trains will rush at a speed of 100 km per hour and more in the ocean. People will cross the Atlantic Ocean in 2 days at the most. It is interesting to recall that the crossing of the ocean on sailing ships of the 15th century was completed in 70 days, the first steamboat spent 26 days on this, and the United States liner, built in 1952, makes such a transition in 3 days and 15 hours. This is a huge ship with a length of 302 meters. 160,000 horsepower of its engines turned 4 propellers, but we already know that a steam engine cannot provide such power. The question arises, what kind of engines are there? It turns out that on it, like on all especially powerful and high-speed combat and transport ships, there are not reciprocating steam engines, but steam turbines. Until quite recently, steam turbines seemed to be a marvel of modern technology. Let's see what it is. Steamer, turboship. Throughout the 19th century, inventors worked hard but unsuccessfully to get the most power out of the steam engine. This had to be done so that large ships could go at high speed. The growth of ships overtook the capabilities of the steam engine. All these efforts did not give the desired results. In the end, however, shipbuilders found out that this goal could be achieved only if a steam engine was built so large that it would occupy the entire ship. It is clear that it was impossible to take this path of increasing the power of the machine. The fact is that the work of steam in the best machines is used for only 1/5 of its energy. That is why it was impossible to achieve more than 5,000 horsepower even from the most seemingly large machine. We already know that steam enters the cylinder of the machine through the spools. Comes in separate portions. Therefore, the piston of the cylinder does not receive continuous pressure from the expanding steam, but separate shocks. In addition, due to the low height of the cylinder, each portion of steam acts for a very short time. And the speed of movement of the piston in the cylinder at the same time is small, no more than 5 to 7 meters per second. If you put a very high cylinder, so that the steam works, accelerating the piston, for a longer time, then again you will have to increase the size of the engine room and the entire ship as a whole. It would be nice to have such an engine in which steam would act evenly during the entire time of operation of this engine. Yes, and move faster. Then the power of the engine would increase immeasurably. Such an engine with permanent steam, called a steam turbine, was created at the end of the last century. In this engine, which makes several thousand revolutions per minute, steam rushes 40 times faster than in a steam engine. So they called it a turbine not by chance. In Latin, turbo means whirlwind. And what is interesting, the turbine project was simultaneously developed by two people who did not know each other at all. These were the Swedish engineer G. Laval and the Englishman C. Parsons. Sailors tell such a story. In 1897, the British fleet lined up on the Dover Road for a solemn parade on the occasion of the anniversary of Queen Victoria. Mighty battleships and swift cruisers froze in anticipation of the Queen's yacht. Everything was ready. And suddenly, instead of the royal yacht, a small narrow ship emerged from somewhere and with incredible speed raced in front of the formation. The fastest patrol car rushed in pursuit of the offender. But where is it? They only managed to read the inscription on the stern, Turbinia. The speed of this ship was 1.5 times higher than the speed of the best sea walkers in the world. That is why the builder and owner of the ship was not only not put on trial for disgrace in the roadstead, but on the contrary, they were very kindly invited to the Admiralty. The builder turned out to be Engineer Parsons. On his ship, he was the first in the world to use a steam turbine. Steam in a turbine works very differently than in a steam engine. If a strong jet of steam, flowing from a conical tube, a nozzle, is directed into a curved channel, then this jet, flowing through the channel, will put more pressure on its concave wall than on a convex one. The action of steam in a turbine is based on this simple property. Steam from several nozzles under high pressure rushes to the curvilinear blades fixed around the circumference of the wheel and rotates it in much the same way as watermill wheels. The turbine has two main parts, one is fixed, called the casing, or stator, and the other is movable, a disc, or rotor, which can rotate. A plurality of guide vanes are attached to the inner wall of the stator. The rotor rim is also studded with hundreds and even thousands of specially shaped rotor blades. They are bent in the direction opposite to the bend of the guide vanes. The gaps between the rotor blades are those curvilinear channels where steam comes from the guide vanes. Steam pressure on the rotor blades causes the turbine rotor to rotate. This is how a single-stage steam turbine works. It was invented by the Swedish engineer Laval. This is how a single-stage turbine works. 1. Steam supply from the boiler. 2. Guide vanes, nozzles. 3. Working blades. 4. Disc, rotor, on which the working blades are fixed. 5. Shaft. 6. Outlet pipe. 7. Capacitor. 8. Cold water supply. 9. Cooling steam tubes. 10. Cooling water outlet. 11. Condensate drain. But such a turbine did not find distribution and eventually gave way to other, more advanced ones. Approximately the same thing happened as with the steam engine, which began to make several cylinders. The fact is that a single-stage turbine could not have a good efficiency. Such a coefficient primarily depends on the temperature and pressure at which the steam begins and ends its work. It turns out that the greater the initial pressure and temperature and the lower the pressure and temperature of the steam leaving the turbine, the more mechanical energy it gives to rotate the rotor. In modern marine turbines, steam enters the guide vanes at a temperature of up to 450 degrees Celsius and a pressure of 65 atmospheres and more. The steam pressure at the end of its operation depends on how rarefied the air is in the turbine condenser. And the pressure in the condenser is 15 to 20 times less than atmospheric pressure. To bring the expanding steam from a pressure of 65 atmospheres to such an insignificant pressure in the condenser, it would be necessary to build an enormous turbine. Therefore, a modern turbine is made not single-stage, but multi-stage. Such a turbine was first created by Parsons. In a multi-stage turbine, a huge amount of heat from steam is not lost immediately, but gradually, in sequentially arranged stages. How does it happen? A multi-stage turbine consists of 2 or even 3 casings. The first casing along the steam path is called the high-pressure turbine, the next, the medium-pressure turbine, and the last, the low-pressure turbine. And inside each body is not one, but many discs with blades. For example, a high-pressure turbine has up to 12 of them. The discs are separated from each other by partitions, diaphragms, in which the guide vanes are located. Entering the high-pressure turbine, the steam expands in the guide vanes and, acquiring a significant speed, goes to the working blades of the first disc, then, into the guide vanes of the next diaphragm, expands in them, picks up speed again and again goes to the working blades of the next, second, disc, and so on. Then, having done work in the first building, the steam sequentially passes into the medium-pressure turbine, and from it into the low-pressure turbine, doing the same work there. Here, the steam pressure decreases gradually, and in each case the steam does useful work. So, it enters the high-pressure turbine with a pressure of 65 atmospheres, the medium-pressure turbine, 15 atmospheres, and it enters the low-pressure turbine with a very low pressure, no more than 2.5 atmospheres. At each stage, the volume of steam increases with decreasing pressure. Therefore, the dimensions of the guide and rotor blades increase from stage to stage. This means that the discs also grow in size. The last discs of the low-pressure turbine are very large. The multi-stage design of turbines made it possible to build them with such a power that they could not even dream of at the beginning of our century. Now the power of the ship's turbine reaches 75,000 horsepower. A turbine with a gear reducer rotates the propeller of the steamer. 1. Boiler, 2. High-pressure turbine, 3. Low-pressure turbine, 4. Reverse turbine, on the same shaft as the low-pressure turbine, 5. Main steam pipeline, 6. Gear reducer, 7. Capacitor, 8. Seawater supply for the condenser, 9. Circulation pump, 10. Outboard water outlet, 11. Auxiliary turbopumps, 12. Thrust bearing, 13 and 14. Intermediate shafts, 15. Propeller, 16. Steering wheel, 17. Engine hatch, 18. Chimney. For the reverse course of the vessel there is a special turbine. Previously, turbines were installed mainly on high-speed warships and large transatlantic express liners. Now they are beginning to be used on ordinary merchant ships. At one of the shipyards in our country, they are starting to build merchant ships, with a carrying capacity of 10,000 tons, on which a double-hull turbine with a capacity of 13,000 horsepower will be installed. It will give the ship a very high speed, 18.5 knots. The steam turbine is a high-speed machine. Its shaft rotates at a speed of several thousand revolutions per minute. What happens when the propeller rotates at such a speed? Useless work will turn out, since the propeller blades will only scatter water around, forming a void around them. There will no longer be pressure of the screw on the thrust bearing, which means that the steamer will not move. This is exactly what happened at first on the Turbinia. For a long time, Parsons could not understand anything. A powerful turbine rotated the propeller at a frantic speed, 2,000 revolutions per minute, and the ship barely moved. Parsons suffered for 3 years, changed 10 screws on the Turbinia, until he found out that the propeller, for the rotation of which the turbine serves, should not rotate at such a speed. For good operation, you need a rotation speed of no more than 250 revolutions. How to be in such a case? How to make a high-speed turbine rotate the propeller with the necessary slowness? To do this, they came up with the idea of connecting the turbine shaft to the ship's shafting using a special gear, a gearbox. Of course, you have all seen a winch for lifting or hauling heavy loads. Such a winch has two gear wheels coupled to each other. The diameter of the wheel that is closer to the winch handle is several times smaller than the other. The use of such wheels gives a big gain in strength. When the handle is rotated, the object is lifted or dragged easily, but very slowly. Roughly the same thing happens with the gearbox. Its gears connect the turbine shaft to the ship's shafting, and through it to the propeller. The dimensions of the wheels are chosen in such a way that the ship's shafting and propeller rotate many times slower than the shaft of a high-speed turbine. Recently, very often, instead of such a gearbox, an electric transmission is used. Here the gears are replaced by electric current. Current is supplied to a low-speed engine, and it calmly rotates the propeller at the speed that is needed. Vessels with electrical transmission from the turbine to the propeller are called turboelectric ships, in contrast to diesel-electric ships, on which the electrical transmission transmits the work of diesel engines to the shafts. Vessels with diesel engines are called motor ships. What is a ship? We already know that the piston of a steam engine is driven by steam, and the steam is produced in a boiler. But boilers take up a lot of space on a steamboat. There were also such ships, where they installed more than 40 boilers. In addition, most of the heat energy obtained from the combustion of fuel is not used, but is lost with the exhaust gases and exhaust steam. In other words, only a small part of the energy of coal or fuel oil is used in a steam engine. In this case, the efficiency of this machine is said to be small. And so, in the second half of the last century, the inventors began to think how to increase, as far as possible, the efficiency of the engine? How to get rid of boilers? How to invent such an engine that does not need either steam or bulky boilers? Is it possible to make sure that the fuel is burned not in boilers, but in the cylinders of the mechanism itself? So the inventors approached the idea of an engine with internal combustion of fuel, but for a long time they could not implement it. Such an engine first appeared in Russia in 1884. Its creator was the captain of the Navy, O.S. Kostovich. Scheme of the Kostovich engine. 1. Combustion chamber. 2. Pistons. 3. Cylinders. 4. Supply of combustible mixture. 5. Exhaust pipe. 6. Camshaft. 7. Crankshaft. 8. Rocker. 9. Connecting rods. 10. Flywheel. Kostovich's engine had 8 horizontal cylinders. And in each cylinder there were 2 pistons, which either approached or diverged. A combustible mixture of air and gasoline vapors was sucked into the cylinders when the pistons diverged. This was the first stroke of the engine, i.e. the suction stroke. With the subsequent convergence of the pistons, the mixture was strongly compressed. This is the second stroke, the compression stroke. When the pistons approached to the limit, an electric spark was given, and the compressed mixture ignited. The explosion of the mixture increased the pressure in the cylinder to several tens of atmospheres. The pistons moved apart with great force. This was the third stroke, the working stroke. At this time, the piston rod with the help of a transmission device rotated the motor shaft. Finally, the pistons approached again and pushed the exhaust gases out through the exhaust valve. This is the fourth stroke, exhaust. After that, the exhaust valve closed, the intake valve opened, and everything was repeated from the beginning. This first gasoline engine designed for an airship is still kept in the Central House of Aviation in Moscow. The gasoline engine has major advantages over the steam engine. It is much lighter than it, consumes many times less fuel, takes up less space than machines with boilers, and requires few people for its maintenance. But it is not suitable for installation on a ship, as it runs on expensive gasoline and is not safe to use. The ship needed an engine that could run not on gasoline, but on safer and cheaper fuel. Many inventors worked on the creation of such an engine. Among them, the Russian designer B.G. Lutsky should be noted. In 1885, he built and successfully tested a 4-cylinder gas engine. But he could not be put on the ship. Inventors continued to work on the creation of a real marine engine, reliable and simple. Something similar was created by the German engineer Rudolf Diesel. At first, Diesel decided that his engine would run on coal powder. He worked on this problem for a long time, and then abandoned its solution. He could not ignite the fuel in the cylinder. Then Diesel decided to use oil as fuel. The same thing happened as with coal powder. Diesel himself wrote about his work on the creation of an oil engine. The first engine does not work, the second works poorly, the third will be good, but the third turned out to be bad. After several years of fruitless work, Diesel gradually abandoned the engine design he had previously conceived. He eventually built an engine that ran on kerosene in 1896. As a matter of fact, diesel achieved the same as Kostovich, but with a delay of 12 years. The oil-fired internal combustion engine, powerful, economical, and safe, was still a dream of inventors. This dream was turned into reality by engineers and technicians from the L. Nobel in St. Petersburg. The business began with the fact that the plant was going in 1897 to build kerosene engines according to the drawings of diesel. Examining these drawings, Russian specialists found many errors in them. I had to change some parts of the engine. Then they thought and decided to remake the engine from kerosene to oil. This work was not easy. But Russian ingenuity helped. In 1899, the engine was ready and successfully passed all the tests. It bore little resemblance to the engine described in diesel's blueprints. But this did not prevent all countries, including Tsarist Russia, from considering diesel as its inventor. Since then, this engine has been unfairly called a diesel engine. But no one dared to deprive our motherland of the championship in the use of this engine on ships. In 1903, the world's first oil-powered ship was successfully tested on the Neva. They named him Vandal. Vandal is the grandfather of modern motor ships. It was equipped with 3 oil engines with a capacity of 120 horsepower each. It was the first ship in the world. So they began to call those ships that are not driven by a steam engine, but by an internal combustion engine, a diesel engine. Vandal, this grandfather of modern motor ships, still exists today. A year after the construction of the Vandal, a second motor ship, the Sarmat, was launched in Salmov. The news of the new Russian ships quickly spread around the world. Foreigners were surprised by the remarkable qualities of motor ships. Yes, and there was something to be surprised. Diesel engines of motor ships consume cheap fuel, oil. The consumption of this fuel was also very small. For example, a ship for a voyage from Baku to Astrakhan then required 9 tons of oil, and the same ship needed 48 tons. The efficiency of these engines was almost twice that of a steam engine with a boiler. The boilers and the stokers serving them disappeared from the ship. And now unnecessary boiler rooms were used to transport additional cargo. Everyone was also amazed by the speed of starting the new engine. It took hours to fire up the boilers and start the steam engine, and minutes to start the diesel engine. Vandal and Sarmat were river boats. The world's first sea ship was built in 1908 also in Russia. It was a large oil tanker, Delo, with 2 diesel engines with a total capacity of 1,000 horsepower. Abroad, the first sea ship appeared only in 1912, and now the vast majority of new ships are motor ships. Work on improving the engines does not stop even now. For example, it is very tempting to use a gas turbine that combines the advantages of an internal combustion engine and a steam turbine. In fact, this is an ordinary turbine, only without any boilers and without steam. Its rotor rotates in the same way as a piston moves in a diesel cylinder, under the pressure of gases formed during the combustion of atomized liquid fuel mixed with compressed air. But there are still very few successful designs of gas turbines. Heart of the ship. The engine of a modern ship is most often 6-cylinder and 2-stroke. The engines of the Vandal, Sarmat, and other motor ships of that time completed the working process in 4 cycles: a suction, compression, working stroke and exhaust. Then the designers came to the conclusion that you can limit yourself to only 2 cycles, at the working stroke and compression. So there was a 2-stroke engine with internal combustion of fuel. Now it is widely used on ships. The device of a twin-screw cargo passenger ship. 1. Team galley. 2. Infirmary. 3. Living quarters of the team. 4. Steering gear compartment. 5. Mines of cargo holds. 6. Interdeck spaces for cargo. 'Tween decks. 8. Propeller shaft corridor. 9. Fuel tanks. 10. Freshwater tanks. 11. Ballast tanks. 12. Tanks of lubricating oil. 13. Closed promenade deck. 14. Emergency diesel dynamos. 15. Passenger cabins. 16. Machine shaft. 17. Workshop. 18. Auxiliary boiler. 19. Laundry. 20. Engine room. 21. Branch of auxiliary engines. 22. Glacier. 23. Galley for passengers. 24. Vestibule. 25. Restaurant. 26. 27. Salons. 28. Captain's cabin. 29. Wheelhouse. 30. Navigation cabin. 31. Upper navigation bridge. 32. Chimney. Exhaust pipes of engines and ventilation shafts are brought into it. 33. Skipper's pantry. 34. windlass, 35, chain box, 36, mast with cargo booms, 37, direction finder antennas, 38, cargo columns with arrows, 39, radar antenna, 40, baffle log and echo sounder. In such an engine, the intake and exhaust valves are replaced by purge windows made in the cylinder walls. At the end of the stroke, the piston falls below the purge windows, and the exhaust gases break out. To completely clean the cylinder of gases, it is blown with compressed air. When the piston begins to rise, it closes the purge windows and gradually compresses the air in the cylinder. From this compression, the air, when the piston reaches its highest position, heats up to 1500 degrees Celsius or more. At this moment, a special pump injects a strictly measured portion of fuel into the cylinder. Under a pressure of several tens of atmospheres, the fuel is sprayed, mixed with hot air and spontaneously ignites. When the fuel burns, gases are formed that push the piston. The engine of a modern ship is most often made of 6-cylinder and 2-stroke. 1. Working cylinder. 2. Water cooling. 3. Nozzle. 4. Compressed air for blowing cylinders. 5. Piston. 6. Exhaust pipe. 7. Fuel pump. 8. Connecting rod. 9. Crankshaft. Further, everything happens in exactly the same way as in a steam engine. The rectilinear return movement of the pistons with the help of connecting rods is converted into the rotational movement of the engine crankshaft. And this shaft, with the help of a shaft line, rotates the propeller shaft with a screw mounted on it. In the engine room of the ship, as on any ship, in addition to the main engines, there are many auxiliary mechanisms. There are various pumps for servicing the main engine, water cooling, fuel, oil. There are many pumps for general ship purposes, ballast, bilge drying, drainage, fire, for domestic needs. There is also a compressor for generating compressed air. All of them are electrified. And the current for work is supplied to them by electric generators installed here. The purpose of these auxiliary mechanisms is different. Coolant pumps supply water to cool the engine cylinder walls. Oil pumps supply oil to lubricate motors and bearings. Ballast pumps are used to pump out or receive water into the double bottom compartments and into special ballast water tanks so that you can change the position of the vessel. Bleeding pumps are designed to remove from the bottom of the vessel a small amount of water that accumulates over time. They are different from the bilge pumps that any ship needs to remove large amounts of water from an accident. Fire pumps supply seawater to the main line, which stretches along all decks of the ship. To supply water in many places on the deck, pipe branches are installed. Flexible fire hoses are attached to these branches when necessary. The line is designed so that after starting the pump, any area of the deck in the event of a fire can receive a powerful jet of water. Special pumps supply water to baths, laundries, washrooms, and drinking water tanks. Compressors produce compressed air to start the engine and to operate pneumatic tools. Fans and blowers drive fresh air into rooms and remove spoiled air. They also supply air to the combustion boilers and to the engines to blow the cylinders. You ask, what does the boilers have to do with it? Does a ship need steam? It turns out that the ship also has a boiler. But it serves for auxiliary purposes, heating the ship's premises, supplying hot water to baths, showers, etc. It is called or auxiliary boiler. It is small in size and therefore does not require a special boiler room. It is usually installed in the upper part of the engine room and connected to the diesel exhaust pipe, so that such a boiler is heated by exhaust gases. And in the parking lot of the ship, when the engine is not running, the auxiliary boiler has to be heated with fuel oil. There are many devices in the engine room of the ship. There hangs something like a huge alarm clock. He even got a call. But on its dial there are not numbers, but inscriptions: get ready, stop, small forward, small back, full back, and others. The device has a large arrow. As soon as the bell rings, in the engine room they immediately look at the arrow, where it will point. Here the arrow stopped opposite the inscription stop. This means that the engine must be stopped immediately. The engine telegraph transmits the captain's order to the mechanic. But why does the arrow move and who gives such orders? It turns out that on the bridge, and in the wheelhouse, there is a device with exactly the same dial. It is installed on a low bedside table, and a handle is attached to the side. Here the captain or his assistant turns the handle until the arrow is, for example, against the inscription small forward. The bell will ring in the car. Everyone will look at the dial and see that here, too, the hand shows small forward. And immediately execute the command. But, before they perform, they will put the handle of their device against the arrow. Then on the bridge the device will ring and the arrow on it will show that the mechanic understood the command. On the bridge at the engine telegraph is the captain. This device for transmitting orders is called a machine telegraph. It is also available on ships. Telegraphs can be mechanical, they have a handle, one device is connected to the arrow of another device by cables or rollers. Now more often used electric machine telegraph. There are no machinists and stokers on motor ships. Such specialties are available only on ships. The engine of the ship is serviced by minders. This specialty is complex and responsible. The mechanic must keep track of everything. He must know how fuel, air and lubricant are supplied to the engines, whether the bearings of the shaft line have overheated and whether there are suspicious knocks in the mechanisms. Motorists of Soviet motor ships know their business well. During the Great Patriotic War, one of the Soviet motor ships was given the task of delivering reinforcements to Sevastopol, which was besieged by the Nazis. It was a cold winter in 1941. The ship had a difficult and dangerous journey. Soviet sailors were not afraid of the huge waves that hit the ship. Storms are common to them. The sailors were worried about something else, as submarines were constantly darting into the sea, and enemy planes were flying in the air. Only the relatively high speed and evasiveness of the ship could save her from bombs and torpedoes. Even a short stop of the engine or a decrease in speed threatened the ship with certain death. It was a severe test for people and for mechanisms. And the Soviet sailors passed this exam perfectly well. For several days, overcoming enemy barriers created by submarines and aircraft, the ship made its way through the ferocious storms of the Black Sea. How many times powerful fountains from falling bombs surrounded the ship? More than once, the ship deftly dodged the foamy trail of a torpedo heading for it. Saved by the experience and vigilance of the Soviet people on duty on the bridge, just as vigilantly stood on watch and minders. Among them was a member of the Komsomol Alexander Morganovsky. 5 years ago, he sailed along the Volga as a sailor on paddle steamers, but only heard about internal combustion engines. Then he got into the Navy. Having passed a 2-year path of technical study, he became one of the best mechanics of the Black Sea Shipping Company. Morganovsky enters the engine room and immediately finds himself in the familiar world of sounds coming from valves, levers, pumps. Each of them has its own special voice, its own muttering. And all this merges into a general hubbub. But the sensitive ear of the minder immediately picks up abnormal wheezing and knocks when they appear. And he quickly determines where to tighten, where to remove and sort out, and where to completely replace a small part. If you do not do this in time, the whole mechanism will deteriorate. There is a special workshop on the ship. She is well equipped. It has a lathe, locksmith tools, a workbench with a vise, and even a small forge with a forge. More than once Morganovsky's knowledge of the matter and vigilance made it possible to carry out preventive repairs in a timely manner. And now, in the interval between enemy raids, Morganovsky suddenly caught in the harmonious sound of the moving parts of the engine barely audible disturbing knocks. To hear them, you need to have a keen ear. Particularly careful attention was needed to isolate this sound from the general noise, not to miss it. In less than a few minutes, Morganovsky had already found the cause of the strange sound. "Comrade mechanic," he reported to the senior mechanic, "the pin on the engine valve has been torn off. The stud that secures the valve cover looks like a very simple detail." But the chief mechanic knew, it would break, air would begin to seep through the cover, and the engine would stop. "How long does it take to fix?" the mechanic asked. "Remember, we cannot stand for long. Every minute you have to wait for a raid from the air." Morganovsky thought for a moment. Usually such work took an hour or more. But now there was nothing to think about this period. "We must reduce it by all means." And he answered firmly. "In a quarter of an hour it will be possible to start diesel again." "Okay, go ahead." And the chief mechanic ordered to stop the engine. Exactly 15 minutes later, Morganovsky reported on the repair of the damage. What is an electric ship? One autumn day in 1838, a small-wheeled vessel was sailing along the Neva River in St. Petersburg. At first glance, it did not deserve any attention. You never know paddle steamers darting back and forth along the river. But more attentive viewers saw something amazing near this vessel. It did not have a chimney and did not smoke. He did not hear the sound of a running machine. Yet the paddle wheels turned and the ship moved. What miraculous power turned the wheels? None of the audience could give a definite answer. Such an answer was given the next day by the St. Petersburg newspapers. They reported that the Russian scientist Boris Semenovich Jacobi invented the world's first electric motor. To prove the possibility of practical application of his invention, Jacobi installed the engine on the ship. This ship was the first electric ship in the world. In addition to the electric motor, there were no mechanisms on the ship, and to obtain an electric current that rotates the engine, a galvanic battery was installed on the first electric ship. The Jacobi electric motor has won its right to life. But it turned out to be unsuitable for the ship. The fact is that the galvanic battery was very bulky, expensive, and the charge in it was enough for a short time. The electric motor developed a power equal to only 1 horsepower. And the ship could move at a speed of only 4 to 5 kilometers per hour. The man walks faster. It is clear that the Jacobi electric motor could not then compete with the steam engine. The electric motor had to temporarily leave the ship. And he returned to the ship again only in 1903. Then for the first time it was installed on the ship Vandal. The world's first motor ships Vandal and Sumat were at the same time the first real electric ships. Why did Jacobi's great invention return to the surface ship so late? Maybe the electric motor remained unusable for the ship? No, he has already managed to prove himself from the very best side. This has been proven by the successful use of electric motors in submarines as early as 1884. What's the matter? It turns out that designers and scientists for a long time failed to develop a full-fledged theory of the electric propulsion of ships and create economical and powerful electric motors required for large ships. Such engines began to appear only in the 20s of our century. By 1932, there were already 250 electric ships worldwide. The power of the mechanisms of some of them reached 160,000 horsepower. And now most of the ships under construction are electric ships. To find out how the electric ship moves, let's look into its engine room. It is very different from the engine room of a steamer. There are no open rods, sliders and connecting rods moving with such a roar and clang that it is difficult for people to talk near them. The engine room of an electric ship is a room filled with bright light, spacious and dazzlingly clean. It has turbines or diesels, and an electric generator is paired with each diesel or turbine. As you know, this generator generates an electric current when the armature rotates. But for this it must be rotated by some kind of engine. If the generator is rotated by a turbine, then the electric ship is called a turboelectric ship, if by diesel, then by diesel-electric ship. Thus, the engine room of an electric ship is the same power plant where electric current is received. The engine room of an electric ship is like a power plant hall. And yet it remains unclear, who rotates the propellers of the electric ship? Everything is clear on the steamer and motor ship. There the shaft of a steam engine, turbine or diesel engine is connected to a line of shafts that ends with a propeller shaft and a propeller. The shafts and the screw rotate, the steamer or motor ship moves. On an electric ship, no shafts from generators go to the stern. How does an electric ship move? We will not find an answer to this question in the engine room of the electric ship. We must go to its stern. There, in a special compartment, 1 or 2 electric motors are installed, according to the number of screws. From these electric motors, shafts with screws mounted on them come out. It is these electric motors that rotate the propellers, setting the electric ship in motion. And they are continuously supplied with current from the engine room by the main power plant. A shaft with a screw mounted on it comes out from the electric motor. 1. Turbo generator. 2. Capacitor. 3. An electric motor that rotates a shaft with a screw. There are many different devices in the engine room of the electric ship. What are there just not here? Starting, measuring, control, signal. And they are all concentrated in one control post, standing in the middle of the engine room. There are also many electrical mechanisms on board the electric ship. And all of them are commanded from the control post by one person. Where necessary, he will press the button, and where he will turn the knob. You look, and the mechanism started working. The shift electrical engineer does not leave the control post. And yet he is aware of where and what is being done. A complete picture of the operation of generators, engines and all electrified mechanisms is shown to him, as on a screen, by measuring and control instruments. Also, without leaving his post, the electrician also learns about malfunctions in the mechanisms. This is where signaling devices come to the rescue. Here, an electric bulb lights up on the control panel. And the officer on duty will immediately know which mechanism reports to him about his malfunction. From the post, they also control the operation of the stern electric motors that rotate the propellers. These electric motors can also be controlled directly from the captain's bridge, bypassing the engine room. This is a great advantage of the electric ship in comparison with steamships and motor ships. And about how this is done, we will tell further. After reading this first part of the book, you may be asking, how come? We read about steamships and motor ships and electric ships, but the title of the book contains only one word, steamboat. Do not forget that the steam engine was the very first mechanical engine. Therefore, the word steamboat is older. And steamboats are still very often called not only steam engine or steam turbine ships, but also any ships with mechanical engines. You yourself have heard more than once how people, seeing a ship, say, "Here comes the steamer." Part 2. Why and how the steamship flows. The story of what the Indian did not know. I didn't make up this story. In one of the stories of the famous writer Jack London, it is written about how one Indian, a resident of Alaska, Nambok, was blown out to sea in a small kayak. He got to the whites, wandered around America for many years, and then returned to his homeland. The whole tribe gave him a solemn welcome. When the excitement of the meeting subsided, the men sat in a circle. The traveler began the story of his amazing adventures. And, finally, he came to the most interesting thing, how he saw the steamer for the first time. Here is what the Indian said, "What a grain of sand is in front of a kayak is in front of a schooner, then a schooner is in front of a steamer. Besides, the steamer is made of iron. He is all iron, but does not sink." "No, no," exclaimed the leader of the tribe, "how can this be? Iron always goes to the bottom. Yesterday my iron knife slipped from my fingers and immediately went down into the very depths of the sea. All homogeneous things obey one law, and all iron obeys one law. So put aside your words so we can honor you. It is, however, so. The ship is all iron, and does not go to the bottom. No, no. It can't be," shouted the Indians. A heated argument broke out here. A peaceful conversation turned into a stormy quarrel. The Indians were dissatisfied with their fellow tribesmen. "The pale faces of our warrior have been spoilt. He tells such lies and is not even embarrassed." Of course, they attacked the narrator in vain. Nambok spoke the absolute truth. But his misfortune was that he could not explain in any way why the iron steamer was still floating. Partly was right and the leader of the tribe. Any solid piece of iron will not float. It will immediately sink. But a hollow object made of iron, such as a bucket, will not immediately sink. The bucket, although iron, floats so much that it is difficult to drown it in the well. And it's even harder to get them water. If you put a piece of iron in a bucket, and then it will not sink, it will float upright. It will only partially sink. And it will sink until its weight, together with a piece of iron, equals the weight of the water displaced by it. Such a law of body swimming was discovered over 2,200 years ago by the ancient Greek scientist Archimedes. Archimedes also found a force supporting a floating body. This, it turns out, is the force of water pressure on the underwater surface of the body. It is called the buoyancy force or the support force. The action of this force can be seen at every step. Try punching holes in the bottom of the floating box. Water will immediately spurt out of the hole. This manifests itself as water pressure. Let's submerge an empty bucket in the water. And not somehow, but vertically, bottom down. You will see that this is not an easy task at all. But now, finally, the edges of the bucket are ready to scoop up water. Now stop clicking on the bucket. And it instantly pops up. This is how the sustaining force works. Archimedes showed that the weight of the water displaced by a floating body and the support force are the same in magnitude. The navigation of the steamer also obeys the law of Archimedes. If a giant blank is forged from the metal that was used to build the ship and lowered into the water, it will immediately go to the bottom. And the ship will not sink because its volume is very large compared to the volume of the metal from which it is made. And the weight of the water displaced by its underwater part is always equal to the weight of the entire vessel. When they want to show the size of a ship, they say, its displacement is so many tons. And by this figure they judge whether a large ship or a small one. What is displacement? And this is the weight of the water displaced by the ship when it sinks to a certain level. but we already know that the weight of the water displaced by the ship, equal to the displacement, is equal to the support force. Consequently, on the bottom and sides of the ship, balancing each other all the time, powerful forces of the same magnitude are pressing, from above, weight, and from below, the support force. If the weight increases, the ship will sink. The support force will become greater, the ship will float. In order for the steamer to float at the same level, the supporting force must be equal to the weight of the ship. Each ship has its own level of immersion when fully loaded. It is marked on both sides of the vessel with a white line. This line shows the ship's load water line. It stretches to its full length. Let's give the ship extra cargo. Then the water line will go under the water, as the ship will sink. This will increase the amount of water displaced, and hence the strength of support. The steamer will continue to sink until this support force equals the new weight of the steamer. Let's increase the weight of the ship again. And yet, the ship, having sunk even deeper, will float, since the supporting force will increase accordingly. So it will be until the upper deck of the steamer is on the same level with the surface of the sea. Then there will be no surface volume of the vessel left, and if a little more cargo is added, the water will rush into the vessel, its weight will become much greater than the supporting force, and the vessel will sink. It is easy to guess that the amount of cargo that a ship can take until it sinks corresponds to the volume of its surface. This volume is called the reserve buoyancy. It is clear that the buoyancy of a vessel depends on the height of its freeboard. The impenetrable side of the ship rises above the surface of the sea, which means that it has a reserve of buoyancy and it floats. The freeboard disappeared under the water, there is no reserve of buoyancy and the ship is sinking. The height of the freeboard is very important for the safe navigation of the ship. The captain has no right to load his ship more than it should, and thereby reduce the freeboard. This is strictly monitored by controllers in all ports of the world. The captain overloaded the ship, they will not let him out of the port, and every captain strives to prevent overload. But water is not the same everywhere. In the rivers it is fresh, in the sea it is salty. And the salinity of the water is not the same. In the Black Sea, one salinity, in the Caspian, another. And more salty water has a greater density. Such dense water has more holding power. There are places with such dense water that even a camel cannot drown in it. This is, for example, the Dead Sea in Palestine. The famous writer Mark Twain talks about swimming in the sea. It was a fun swim. We couldn't drown. Here you can stretch out on the water at full length, lying on your back and folding your arms over your chest, with most of the body remaining above the water. In this case, you can completely raise your head. You can lie very comfortably on your back with your knees up to your chin and wrapping your arms around them, but you will soon roll over as your head outweighs. You can stand on your head, and from the middle of the chest to the end of the legs you will remain out of the water. You will not be able to swim on your back, moving any noticeably, since your legs stick out of the water and you have to push off only with your heels. The horse is so unstable that can neither swim nor stand in the Dead Sea, she immediately lies on her side. Water has a different density and at different times of the year. In the same sea in winter there is one density, and in summer another. So it turns out that the same ship with the same cargo will be loaded differently under different conditions. It is not easy for the captain to figure out whether he overloaded or underloaded his ship. This is where the load line comes to the rescue. Who among you has seen sea steamships close by? He probably paid attention to the drawing painted on both sides of the ship. The load line is applied on both sides of the vessel. On the left in the figure is a circle crossed out with a bold line. We see the same feature at the upper deck, just above the center of the circle. This is the deck line. To the right of the circle is something that looks like a comb. And comb lines are marked with letters. These are the load marks showing the immersion of the steamer in various sailing conditions. And the distances from the marks to the deck line give the freeboard height necessary for safe navigation in these conditions. The brand marked with the letter L is called summer. It goes through the center of the circle. This stamp shows the level of immersion of the steamer when sailing in ordinary seas in summer. And a stamp with the letter Z in winter. And, for example, a stamp with the letter T shows the level when sailing a steamer in tropical seas. Each brand has its purpose. By these marks, it is already easy for the captain to figure out where and how his ship should be loaded. But for the safety of the vessel, it is not enough that it floats at a certain level of immersion and does not sink. It is also necessary that it does not tip over from the impact of a wave or from other causes that cause a roll. This is what happened 50 years ago to a steamship, the General Slocum. It was built in America for New Yorkers to walk along the Hudson River. The builders of the steamboat were told before it was built, a steamboat must have 3 qualities: to accommodate as many people as possible, to have a high speed, and to give passengers the best comfort. The customers did not think about the safety of the ship. They had one goal, to attract more passengers and make the most profit from each flight. And builders paid attention mainly to these requirements. The ship turned out to be long, narrow and multi-story. It went on its maiden voyage with 700 passengers on board. The weather was sunny and windless. Everything seemed to be conducive to an interesting, calm voyage. Passengers crowded on the uppermost deck, admiring the picturesque banks of the river. Gradually, almost all people moved to the starboard side. From there, a more beautiful panorama of the coast opened up. At first, none of the passengers noticed the steamer's slight roll to starboard, everyone was so busy watching. But the list quickly increased, bringing the upper deck closer to the surface of the river. Then the passengers in a panic rushed to the opposite side. The steamer swung rapidly following the movement of people, lost its balance and capsized. The steamer swung rapidly following the movement of people. A fascinating walk along the Hudson River ended in the death of several hundred people. It all happened because the ship was unstable. And what does it mean for a ship to be stable? This means sailing straight if there are no reasons that can cause the ship to roll. Well, what if a big wave hits the ship or another reason for the roll appears? Then roll, but do not tip over. And when these reasons disappear, immediately straighten up. Maybe you have seen the breathtaking spectacle of a yacht race. When a yacht is sailing in a crosswind, she has a very large heel. But after turning, the yacht straightens up. What makes the yacht straighten up? All the same law of Archimedes. Under the action of the support force, the part of the hull plunging during the roll tends to emerge. If it does not float, then the ship is unstable. But even a stable ship with too much roll can capsize. When a new vessel is being drafted, the calculations find the largest allowable heel angle at which it will not capsize yet, but will return to the upright position. The creators of the ship project have another concern. It turns out that the stability of the ship is also affected by how the cargo is located on it. You can arrange them so badly that the ship will float with a constant roll. It has also been established that the stability of the ship is the better, the lower the cargo is located. That's why people always sit on the bottom of a sailboat. And a heavy lead keel is specially attached to the bottom of the yacht. But did you know that the tanks located in the bottom of the ship are often filled with water, if it goes empty? All this is done in order to lower the center of gravity and, therefore, improve the stability of the vessel. However, to achieve too much stability is not worth it. The more stable the ship, the faster and sharper its pitching. But good stability is not everything for the safety of the ship. More strength is also needed, like a bin steamer ripped apart. Every student knows what peas are. The textbook on peas says, this is an important food crop. The fruit of the pea has 2 wings, to which the seeds are attached. Such a fruit is called a bean. There are also cocoa beans, coffee beans. But if a schoolboy is told that beans can break a steamboat, he will not believe it. What nonsense! He will say. Where have you seen beans torn apart on a steamboat? What is this, a torpedo? And yet such a case with beans really happened. Once, it was around 1933, the steamer Bolgarov was sailing from abroad to his native shores. All his holds were filled to overflowing with beans. Not far from Istanbul, a nuisance occurred, the steamer ran into a rocky shoal. Having ironed the stones with the bottom, Bolgarov went on, and would have reached Odessa, if not for the beans. It turned out that the walk on the stones did not go well. In the bottom, under one of the cargo holds, a hole was formed through which water began to flow inside. If the ship had an ordinary cargo, and not beans, nothing special would have happened. Water would fill only one cargo hold, since it would not be allowed to go further than watertight transverse partitions, bulkheads separating this hold from neighboring ones. And the matter would have ended with the Bolgarov plunging deeper into the water, and from this it would have somewhat lost in speed. But the beans decided the fate of the steamer in a different way. The water rose higher and higher, penetrating through all the cracks between the beans. No matter how densely the beans are poured, there will always be a way for water. beans, absorbing water, began to swell. And swollen beans need more space. But there was just enough room in the hold to hold dry beans, not swollen ones. What was left for the beans to do in search of space? They had only one thing to do, and to press with all their might on the walls and deck of the hold. And the strength of swollen beans in cramped quarters is no small matter. Scientists have calculated that at 25% of the absorbed water, the beans press on any body that prevents them from swelling with a force of 30 kilograms per square centimeter. Such pressure can be experienced by the hull of a submarine at a depth of 300 meters. But in order to withstand it, this case has a special cylindrical shape, and it is very durable. The ship does not need to dive to a depth of 300 meters. This means that its hull is not made as strong as that of a submarine. It is clear that the pressure of the beans could not end in good. With a deafening crash, the seams of the sides and deck burst in the area of the flooded hold. The ship broke into two separate floating parts, bow and stern. The towing steamer called to the accident site dragged the bow half of the Kharkov to Sevastopol, and then returned for the stern. The tugboat dragged half of the Kharkov to Sevastopol. The sailors then joked for a long time that the steamship Kharkov is the longest ship in the world, the bow is in Sevastopol, the stern is in Constantinople. Constantinople is the former name of Istanbul. Soon, both halves of Kharkov were connected into one with the help of electric welding. That's what harmless beans can do. Of course, shipbuilders could not foresee this. When the Kharkiv was built, the strength of its hull was designed for normal sea conditions. And the hull of a steamer is considered strong if it does not break from its weight, being placed on one or two supports. There was once such a case with a small steamer. Near the shore, he fell into a thick fog. The captain steered the ship carefully, at the slowest pace. But it did not help. The steamer fell into a narrow passage between two large rocks. The bow slipped, and the stern, as a wider one, got stuck. In vain did the captain turn the handle of the engine telegraph, giving it full forward, then full reverse. The stern of the ship was so jammed with rocks that no machine could help. The ship's stern was blocked by rocks. To top it off, the tide began to ebb. The water from under the steamer left and it hung in the air with its bow. This accident caused great concern. Journalists and photographers came to the scene. The ship was written about for a long time in newspapers and magazines. And everyone was amazed. This is such an amazing steamship, it hangs in the air and does not break. In fact, there was nothing to be surprised about here. The boat was short and wide. If it were long and narrow, like all high-speed vessels, and even with insufficient hull strength, its bow would probably break off. A long and narrow steamer can break even on the water, especially in stormy weather. In calm water, for example, on a river, the most fragile steamer lies as if on a feather bed. Calm water supports the ship's hull along its entire length. Another thing is when he finds himself on big waves. There are two most dangerous situations here. The first, when the wave will support the ship only in the middle, and the bow and stern will find themselves in weight. In this case, the ship is said to be at the top of the wave, but it can also be the other way around. The bow and stern will rest on the high crests of the wave, and the middle will hang over the dip, over the bottom of the waves. Right here, at least the steamer folds in half. And more than once steamships broke on the wave. These are the worst cases. On them, the strength of the ship's hull is calculated. On big waves there can be two dangerous positions. A house on earth is built solidly and firmly. But try to make its foundation or interfloor floors weak. The house will sink, or even collapse altogether. The ship is also a multi-story building, with walls, ceilings and floors. But the foundation under it is shaky water. Such a foundation does not stand still, especially in stormy weather. On this foundation the ship walks in different directions, emerges and sinks, turns and sways sharply from side to side. During such movements, the ship's hull experiences the action of a wide variety of very large forces. All these forces must be reliably resisted. The ship was caught in a terrible storm. Here the waves test all parts of its hull for bending, breaking, tearing, and torsion. Let it bend on a big wave, like a spring. Let it bend, as long as it doesn't break, as long as it's strong. And to make a steamship durable means to correctly select the dimensions of all the details of the skeleton and shell of its hull. Complicated calculations are done by engineers to get the job done. Here they come to the aid of the building mechanics of the ship, the science of the strength of the ship, created by generations of scientists, shipbuilders and sailors. This science makes it possible in advance, before the construction and testing of the ship, to be sure of the strength of its hull. But in life there are such cases, that the calculations are all correct, the ship must be strong, and when it meets waves, it breaks in half. Here it is not the calculations that are to blame, but the poor quality of the construction. An old captain of the Soviet fleet told us about one such case. Tale of the Old Captain. It happened shortly before the end of the Great Patriotic War. I was then in command of the Liberty-class cargo steamer, which had just been built in the USA. We crossed the restless Bering Sea. A terrible storm raged with frost and blizzard, a phenomenon common to this region. The waves crashed into the bow of the deck in powerful waterfalls. The ship was tossed from side to side. From the mighty blows of the waves, the ship shuddered. Suddenly, I heard a deafening roar, reminiscent of a gunshot. The ship's hull shook violently. In the navigational cabin, a clock flew off the wall. Inspection of the damage showed that in the middle part of the vessel, in front of the superstructure, the upper deck and side to the very bottom burst in some space. Water poured into the hold through a side crack. The rush I announced took place in a cruel and stubborn struggle with the elements. All the steel cables we had were used to pull the bow of the ship from the stern. They tried to put a patch on the crack, but to no avail. From pitching, the crack increased to 15 centimeters. This went on for more than a day. The impact of the waves pulled the steel cables like strings. It was clear that the steel cables could not withstand such tension for a long time. Indeed, by the end of the next day, the ship began to experience strong tremors. There was an ominous rattle of steel. The wave raised the bow of the vessel high, the cables burst, and it separated from the stern. Only one sailor remained on it, Shibanov. Soon the bow half, carried away by the raging sea, disappeared into the darkness. The bow half disappeared into the darkness. Poor Shibanov, I thought, what will happen to him? There are 53 of us on the stern of the ship. In such a team, you can endure any misfortune. And he's all alone. For more than 50 years I have sailed on various ships, but I have not yet had to command on the wreck of a steamer. But it wasn't worth the hassle. The rush continued. Each sailor showed great courage, resourcefulness and fortitude. It was difficult to single out heroes among our crew. All were heroes. People worked in icy water that penetrated through the damaged transverse bulkhead. The first step was to repair the damage in it and properly reinforce it. After all, this bow bulkhead of the engine room actually became the bow, the stem, of our unusual vessel. It was necessary to ensure that it could withstand the blows of the waves. And we have achieved this. Water continued to flow, but less. To level our ship, water was pumped into the aft compartments. The wreck could float on the waves. Now the amazing journey could continue. An oncoming ship tried to help us. Tried to take it in tow. But his efforts were in vain. The towing rope under the pressure of the waves stretched to the limit and burst with a terrible crash. And we continued our drift alone. I involuntarily recalled the heroic drift of the Seedorf steamer, covered in ice. There was one danger, the ice could crush him like a nut with tongs. Here we were threatened by another thing, to be broken by powerful blows of the waves. We didn't even have lifeboats, and they were wrecked by a storm. So we dangled along the boundless stormy sea for several days. These days dragged on painfully long. In addition, the thought of the missing Shibanov was oppressive. Has he died? But the storm has eased. A tugboat approached us. And 9 days after the disaster, we ended up in one of the ports of the Aleutian Islands. Soon the nasal half was also delivered there. She was discovered at sea and taken in tow by another ship. And Shibanov was alive. Can you imagine the joy of our meeting? Only a Soviet person can endure such trials as have befallen him. All the days of his extraordinary journey, Shibanov ate food that he found in life rafts. In such rafts, a special emergency supply of food is always kept in case the ship dies. The situation with drinking water was worse. She was nowhere. But even here Shibanov came out of the situation. He used the ice build-up that formed on the cargo winches when they were ferried in the winter cold. All soaked to the skin. Shibanov fought desperately against the storm. He was overcome by sleep, strength often left, but he continued to work, saving his strange ship. One should have seen how both parts of the broken steamer were brought into the port. There was no end to the amazement of the inhabitants. Even experienced sailors of foreign ships standing in the port, and they were amazed, and that's how miracles are. People from the next world came, nobody believed his eyes. How is it possible to avoid inevitable death, and even save the wreckage of the ship? And everyone enthusiastically welcomed the Soviet sailors. Why did an American steamship break? Maybe one of the readers will think that the story of the old captain is a fiction. Well, how is it that the ship broke in half, but floats? Of course, a person familiar with shipbuilding science will not have such doubts. Yes, and in the history of navigation there are several cases similar to those described by the old captain. Didn't the same thing happen to the steamer Kharkov? You can still tell about the same interesting cases with other courts. Here, for example, what happened during the Great Patriotic War on the Lower Volga. Bombs of fascist planes severely damaged the Lozva and Sudogda oil barges. At Lozva, the entire bow was turned around, and at Sudogda, the stern. There was no point in repairing the ships. It's cheaper to build new ones. But this would take a lot of time and steel. And steel, like other materials, went for the front, for guns, tanks, warships. Meanwhile, the country persistently demanded, bring more oil to the front. What to do? And the Soviet shipbuilders found a way out. They decided to make one fit out of two worthless ships. How is it possible? And it's very simple. The destroyed halves were cut off from both ships, and then the bow of the Sudogda was connected together with the stern of the Lozva. And all this was done afloat. So 10 days later a new oil tanker was put into operation. In size, it was even larger than Lozva or Sudogda separately. But still it is surprising, why did not the halves of the steamers sink, and why did they sail for many days on the raging sea? The fact is that each steamer is partitioned off by steel impenetrable walls running across, from the bottom to the deck. These walls are called transverse bulkheads. They divide the ship into several compartments. Transverse bulkheads divide the ship into several compartments. 1. Bow ballast compartment, forepeak. 2. Cargo hold number 1. 3. Cargo hold number 2. 4. Cargo hold number 3. 5. Boiler room. 6. Engine room. 7. Cargo hold number 4. 8. Cargo hold number 5. 9. Aft ballast compartment, afterpeak, like the forepeak serves to destroy the longitudinal inclination of the vessel. Trim. 10. Double bottom space. The larger the ship, the more transverse bulkheads it has. There are also such steamships, where, for greater strength and a reduction in the size of the compartments, longitudinal bulkheads are also installed. These bulkheads run along the ship, at some distance from the sides. If a hole forms in one place, water will fill only one compartment. In other compartments, separated by transverse bulkheads from the damaged one, it will be dry. With one compartment flooded, the ship will not sink. It's all calculated that way. What happened to the ships Kharkov and Liberty? But it turned out that they burst in one place, and the compartment disappeared. Well, what of this? The rest of the compartments of both halves of the ship remained intact. And no water got in. Cross bulkheads stood in her way, separating the disappeared compartment from the neighboring ones. Both halves retained equality between their weight and strength of support, and they floated like whole ships. The steamships Kharkov and Liberty have the same nature of the accident. But the reason for it is different. The steamer Kharkov brought beans. And in the case of the Liberty, it was not the beans and not so much the storm that were to blame, but the poor quality of the whole construction. Recall the history of the construction of ships of this type. There was a Second World War. The United States of America undertook to supply its allies in Europe with weapons, various equipment and food. And to transport all this, thousands of new ocean-going steamers were required. Many U.S. firms undertook to build them. They seem to have coped with the task, having delivered more than 2,500 such vessels within the scheduled time. But the first steamers of the Liberty type left with a cargo for Europe. And soon alarms about accidents began to come from them from the sea. The reason for these accidents was that the steamers did not have sufficient strength. Cracks formed in the decks in many places. Steamboats broke down. Steamboats, not possessing sufficient strength, broke down. The accidents of the Liberty steamers became so frequent that a special commission had to be appointed to investigate the causes of the accidents. In 1944, the commission inspected many of these ships. The results of the inspection were amazing. 432 steamships could not be set sail. Big changes were needed. In the same year, the decks of 20 ships burst, and 5 were broken in half. The Liberty steamers were hastily built, in pursuit of huge profits, with little regard for the quality of construction. In our country, steamships are built especially durable, suitable for any sailing conditions. During the Great Patriotic War, there were cases when our ships received heavy damage from Nazi bombs and torpedoes, but did not sink, but safely reached their destination. The heroic voyage was made by the motor ship of the Black Sea Shipping Company Kuban, built in the years of the first 5-year plan by Leningradis. In a winter storm, under enemy fire, the Soviet sailors of the Kuban fearlessly performed their duty. They did not lose their heads even when 8 enemy bombers attacked the ship at once. Aircraft dropped 20 bombs on the ship, and some of them caused very heavy damage to the hull. And yet the ship performed a responsible task. True heroism was shown by the sailors of the ship Old Bolshevik under the command of Captain Afanasiev. The Old Bolshevik sailed at the beginning of the war in the Atlantic Ocean. He transported goods needed for the front, to defeat the Nazi invaders. Once the ship, in a caravan with other ships, made its usual voyage from America to Murmansk under the protection of warships with a cargo of ammunition. On the way, a whole flock of fascist bombers and torpedo bombers ran into them. And then the caravan was surrounded by enemy submarines. For 6 days in a row, ships were subjected to fierce attacks from the air and sea. The ship Old Bolshevik had a particularly hard time. About 50 bombs were dropped on the ship. The captain spent days and nights on the bridge. "Let's get through," he confidently told the sailors, "we must break through." Enemy bombs were bursting at the side, behind the stern, right on the bow, and the captain Afanasiev, precisely maneuvering, skillfully took the ship out of the blows. But one of the bombs nevertheless exploded in the bow of the ship, pierced the upper deck. A fire broke out. Every sailor had the same thought: if the fire penetrates the hold, the end of the ship, we will explode. One of the English destroyers of the convoy rushed to the ship. His commander suggested that the crew leave the burning ship as soon as possible and go aboard his ship. But the sailors of the ship refused. Risking their lives, they put out the fire and saved their ship. The ship, barely staying on the water from damage, nevertheless reached Murmansk and delivered a valuable cargo. Right to board. You just read about how the heroic ship dodged German bombs. But after all, in order to maneuver so deftly, the composure and experience of the captain himself are not enough. It is also necessary that the ship has a reliable steering gear and, as sailors say, good agility. Every ship, whether commercial or military, large or small, must have a rudder. And even if there is a steering wheel, but its control has deteriorated? Then it is useless, the ship becomes helpless, a toy in the power of the sea. And on cramped waterways, an inevitable accident awaits him. True, trouble can still be prevented if the ship has 2 propellers, which means 2 cars. With 2 machines, when one of them works in forward and the other in reverse, the vessel can turn around in a small body of water. But a merchant ship with 2 propellers is a very rare occurrence. When it comes to the steering wheel and its management, one involuntarily recalls the story of the accident of one ship. It has just left the building and went to sea to test mechanisms and devices. The captain led the ship along a narrow channel leading from the port to the open sea. In the distance, at the entrance to the canal, the vague outlines of some oncoming ship appeared. Soon it was already possible to see that a heavily loaded tanker was heading into the port. The distance between the ships was shrinking every minute. The people on the tanker are already clearly visible. According to the maritime rules, oncoming ships had to disperse on the left sides. From the tanker came one short sound of a horn. In the conventional maritime language, this meant, "I am changing my course to the right side." There was an answering horn from the ship. The captain commanded in a low voice, "A right on board." "Yes, right on board." The helmsman answered and began to turn the steering wheel. After that, the helmsman had to report, as usual, the rudder is on board. But no such report followed. Something incredible happened. Instead of turning to the right, the ship, under the influence of wind and current, began to lean towards the tanker. It turned out that the steering device suddenly failed, the steering wheel remained motionless. Everything else happened within seconds. The captain did nothing. The ship crashed headfirst into the side of the tanker with a terrible crash. This is what the inaction of the steering wheel led to at the decisive moment. How is the steering wheel arranged and how does it work? The rudder is a specially shaped steel plate suspended vertically astern. This plate, it is called the rudder blade, is suspended on hinges and can be rotated to the right and left. Now streamlined rudders are especially widely used. In appearance, they are similar to the wings of aircraft. With such a rudder, the ship turns better. In addition, this rudder, located behind the propeller, improves the operation of the propeller and thereby even increases the speed of the vessel. The streamlined steering wheel consists of a frame sheathed on both sides with steel sheets. The interior space is sometimes left empty, and most often filled with wood or resin. Rudders are of three types. There are three types of steering wheels: ordinary, balanced and semi-balanced. In an ordinary steering wheel, the axis of rotation passes at the leading edge of its pen. In the balancing one, about 1/3 of the feather is located in front of the axis of rotation. This front part of the pen is called the balancer. The semi-balanced steering wheel has the shape of an ordinary steering wheel in the upper part, and a balancing steering wheel in the lower part. Due to the convenient position of the axis of rotation, the balanced and semi-balanced rudders rotate easily. Therefore, they require less force to turn. This is very important for high-speed vessels, where such rudders are installed. As long as the rudder is straight, the ship will move in a straight line, unless it is affected by wind or current. Jets of water flow calmly around both surfaces of the steering wheel, without exerting any pressure on them. And now we will reject the steering wheel from a straight position. Let, for example, the steering wheel be deflected to starboard. Then, from the left side, the water will still calmly flow around the steering wheel. And from the starboard side, the jets of water will meet the surface of the rudder blade placed in their way and will press on it with great force. It is this force that will bring the stern of the vessel to the left, and turn the bow to the right. When the rudder is deflected at some angle, the ship will turn in the same direction as the rudder blade. Can a stationary ship turn with the action of the rudder? Of course not. After all, a stationary ship does not have jets of water around the rudder. This means that there will be no pressure on the surface of the turned steering wheel. Now, on the move of the ship, we will reject the rudder at a certain angle and leave it in that position. We will see that the ship begins to describe a curved line, which will soon turn into a circle. This rotation of the ship is called circulation. And the diameter of the circle along which the ship moves is called the circulation diameter. The circulation diameter is a very important value. It allows you to determine how agile the ship is. And agility is a very important nautical quality of a vessel, which must change the direction of its movement in the smallest space, in the shortest time and with the least effort applied to the rudder. The more agile the ship, the easier it is to turn around in tight quarters, the less danger it has of colliding with another ship. The practice of navigation has established that the smaller the diameter of the circulation, the better the agility. The circulation diameter is measured in ship lengths. Usually they say so, the diameter of the circulation has so many lengths. In the most agile vessel, the circulation diameter is no more than 3 or 4 lengths, and in sluggish vessels it reaches 8. Steering wheel diagram. But, in addition to good agility, the ship also requires course stability. Course stability means that the boat must keep the rudder straight on the exact course, and not yaw to the right and to the left, requiring constant rotation of the steering wheel. When the ship is roaming, you need to work hard at the helm before it rolls back in the right direction. And when it rolls, it is difficult to win it in order to set it on a given course. The wind and currents are primarily responsible for the yaw of the ship. But more often than not, stability on the course is lost in waves. Yaw forces the ship off course, makes it move in zigzags. And this lengthens the path of the vessel, requires excessive fuel consumption, and in cramped conditions can lead to an accident. The stability of the vessel on the course depends on many factors, but especially on the experience, skill and attentiveness of the helmsman on duty. It seems that it is not so difficult to turn the steering wheel in order to change the direction of the vessel in time and keep it on a given course. In fact, this work requires great skill and intense attention. The steering wheel should be shifted slowly and smoothly, and should not be deflected to a large angle. From this, the ship will yaw and skip the set course when returning to it. The helmsman must take into account the operation of the main machine in different conditions, and the influence of the wind, and the action of waves, and even the depth of the sea under the keel. It is known that in a shallow place the ship does not obey the helm well. Here the steering wheel will have to be rejected at a large angle. The work of the helmsman in stormy weather requires special attention and skill. With a tail wave, the ship abruptly rushes away from the set course. Here it is necessary all the time to monitor the throws of the vessel and in advance to deflect the rudder from the direct position at a certain angle. This will significantly reduce yaw. And it's even harder to steer when sailing in ice. As you can see, the watch at the helm is a complex and responsible business. There is another very important circumstance. Judge for yourself, the steering wheel is somewhere below the stern, but should obey the action of the steering wheel. After all, they are separated from each other by tens of meters. How does the steering wheel turn the steering wheel? And what a wheel! On some ships it weighs 100 tons or more. Try to turn such a steering wheel, and even with the effort of only one person. Of course, now the steering wheel is not turned by a person. He only turns the wheel. A special steering machine is connected to the steering wheel. Turned the steering wheel, the car started working. She began to wind the chain or cable around the drum. Such a chain or cable is called a störtros. Störtros goes aft. There, the rudder axis, the stock, comes out through the deck, and the tiller lever is mounted on it. Störtros will pull the tiller and the steering wheel will turn. At all? No, a little, and at most, 35 degrees. The steering wheel even has a limiter, he won't go any further. They will direct the steamer on a given course, and the machine, having done its job, will stop itself. Turn the steering wheel in the other direction, the car will work back. And now one end of the chain is wound from the drum in the opposite direction, and the other is wound. In the other direction pulls störtros and tiller. In the same direction and the steering wheel turns, but this happens on small ships, and on large ships there are no steering cables. And the car itself is close to the tiller. Störtros is replaced by a special device. It is called a hydraulic telemotor. The telemotor has two cylinders with pistons. One cylinder is on the bridge and is connected to the steering wheel, and the other is on the stern and is paired with the steering machine. Not chains are laid between the cylinders, but tubes. Both cylinders and tubes are always filled with water with glycerin. Glycerin is needed so that the water does not freeze in winter. In obedience to the turn of the steering wheel, the hydraulic steering machine turns the steering wheel. 1. Electric telemotor. 2. Wires from the steering wheel. 3. Pumps with electric motors. 4. Connecting tubes. 5. Hydraulic presses, cylinders with pistons. 6. Tiller. 7. Baller, axle, of the steering wheel. 8. Rudder feather. Here the helmsman begins to turn the steering wheel. This sets the piston of the cylinder on the bridge in motion. This piston, through the liquid, presses on the piston of the stern cylinder, and with the help of levers, it sets the steering gear in motion. And the machine rotates the tiller along with the steering wheel. There is also an electric telemotor. In such a telemotor, an electric current acts instead of a liquid. And the steering machine is an electric motor installed near the steering wheel. Here the helmsman turns the steering wheel in one direction. The rotation of the handwheel in a special gear activates the starting device to turn on the current. The current runs through the wires and causes the motor shaft to rotate in the same direction as the handwheel. And the shaft is connected to the tiller by a special mechanical transmission. And thus the electric current turns the steering wheel. Sometimes the transmission from the electric motor to the tiller is made not mechanical, but hydraulic. Then the electric motors sit on the same shaft with special pumps. These pumps are connected by tubes to two hydraulic presses, and the pistons of the presses are connected to the tiller. In accordance with the turn of the steering wheel, an electric telemotor directs a jet of fluid from the pumps into one of the hydraulic presses. The liquid presses on the press piston, the piston on the tiller, and the steering wheel turns. Hydraulic transmission is even more reliable than mechanical transmission. It is widely used on large ships, where very large forces are required to shift the rudder. On each ship, in addition to mechanical steering, there must be an independent and manual one. The steering wheel of the emergency hand drive is located at the tiller itself. To rotate such a steering wheel, the effort of not one, but several of the strongest sailors is required. And yet the steering wheel turns very slowly. It is good that you almost never have to use a manual drive, and reliable mechanisms help a person to control the ship. Steamboat among the raging elements. It's good to sail on a steamboat in wonderful weather. Water is like a mirror. Like a shadow, a ship glides over it. You don't even feel like you're on a steamboat. Only a slight trembling of the hull from the rotation of the propeller reminds you that you are not on solid ground. Leaning on the railings, you delight in breathing in the fresh air. Your eyes never leave the sea. You feel happy. That would stretch this pleasure for months. Around you, on deck, there are many such lucky people. But what is it? Shaggy clouds are gradually gathering in the sky, the ominous heralds of the storm. Here on the surface of the sea white lambs ran. Oncoming water is no longer so calmly flowing around the sides of the ship. She viciously hits the side and a powerful cascade of spray pours over the bow of the ship. The ship rolls heavily from side to side. And the storm is getting stronger. No longer spray, but water mountains fall onto the ship. A salty downpour pours over even a tall bridge. Passengers from the deck were blown away by the wind. They all hid in their cabins. Many are in bed. Excruciating bouts of seasickness haunt them. The heads of these recent lucky ones are now occupied with other thoughts. Hurry up the port. I wish I could feel solid ground under my feet rather than a rocking deck. Hurry up and get off the ship, which has become so hateful. It is not easy for the ship's crew accustomed to pitching. A lot of worries during the storm to the top team. Here is how a sailor from the Soviet ship Yenisei describes the storm experienced in the Atlantic Ocean. Waves crashed onto the deck and spread over the bow of the ship with a deafening noise. The cold wind pierced to the bone. Visibility was terrible. The ship veered off course. The attention of watchmen on the bridge is strained to the extreme. Something unimaginable was happening on deck. All objects, as if well fixed, suddenly moved. Barrels of machine oil danced across the deck, dispersing in a wide round dance. The fastenings of one of the lifeboats loosened, and she began to beat against the davit. Waves and wind violently tore the tarpaulin covering the cargo hatches. Here is a powerful waterfall with terrible force hit the bow wall of the middle superstructure. He knocked out the front door, tore off the ladder leading to the bridge, knocked out 2 frames with glass on the bridge. Water broke into the interior of the superstructure. The sailors worked in fits and starts, when streams of seething water descended from the deck for a while. And there was a lot of work. Particularly difficult was the sealing of the broken door opening. Finally, the opening was sealed with boards, felt and tow. The water was pumped out of the premises. The ladder to the bridge has been restored, all items on the deck are more securely fixed. Somehow they managed to fix the lifeboat. Under normal circumstances, all this work would take a trifling amount of time. But here, in the midst of the raging elements, these were long hours of inhuman labor and genuine heroism of the sailors. Below, in the engine room of the ship, there is no wind and waves. But even here it is not easy. It is difficult to maintain mechanisms and boilers when you can barely stand on your feet from the jerky movements of the ship. Once, during a storm, water got into the engine room of the Soviet steamer MSTA through a fan pipe. It spread further, into the stoker, and was already creeping up to the furnaces of the boiler. Soon the steam pressure in the boiler dropped. The machine stopped working at full capacity. There was a threat of stopping the ship. What to do? There was only one remedy, to find the cap of the mouth underwater, open it and drain the water into the double-bottom space. The watch mechanic Shulapov without hesitation jumped into the icy water. Acting on the touch, he began to unscrew the nut by nut on the neck cover. At times, when water fell on the furnaces, Shulapov was doused with hot steam, but he did not retreat. Shulapov spent an hour and a half in the icy water, but he did his job. In the end, he managed to slightly open the neck cover and drain the water into the double-bottom compartment. Rolling is harmful not only to people. It greatly reduces the speed of the ship. It loosens the bonds of the body and breaks its strength. And with a large pitching, a steamer with poor stability can even capsize. Therefore, when developing a project for a new steamship, special attention is paid to its behavior during rolling. The creator of the ship's pitching spider is the outstanding Russian shipbuilder academician Alexei Nikolaevich Krylov. Before Krylov, many foreign scientists were engaged in the theory of pitching. But none of them completed their work. The reason was the great complexity of this issue. After all, during the pitching on the ship is influenced by many different circumstances. The magnitude and nature of the roll depend not only on the waves themselves, but also on the size of the vessel, the shape of its hull, on the placement of cargo on it, on the speed of the vessel and on the angle at which this vessel moves relative to the waves. That is why many scientists, having begun the development of the theory of pitching, were convinced of the futility of their efforts. And the most famous shipbuilder in England, Reed, openly, to the whole world, declared the impossibility of a complete solution to the problems of pitching. And so A.N. Krylov, then still a young Russian scientist, took up the solution of this problem. In the course of this work, he had the opportunity to test and practice the correctness of his scientific conclusions. This happened in 1895. The royal yacht Polar Star was supposed to head to Libau to take the Tsar and his retinue on board there. But the captain of the yacht flatly refused to comply with the order. It was a clear disobedience, threatening the captain of the yacht with major troubles and even court. And yet he stubbornly refused to sail the ship to Libau. Then it turned out that the reason for this behavior of the commander was the shallowness of the canal leading from the Baltic Sea to the port of Libau, and a strong wave. It turns out that an experienced sailor foresaw the possibility of hitting the bottom of the rocky bottom, even with a slight pitching of the yacht. And he decided, it is better to go into conflict with the king than to allow an accident. The scandal was huge, A.N. Krylov recalls in his notes, but there was nothing to do. The Tsar had to go to St. Petersburg by rail. And now the young professor of the Maritime Academy, A.N. Krylov, is instructed to figure out whether the yacht commander was right in refusing to sail the ship to Libau or not. Academician Alexei Nikolaevich Krylov, 1863–1945. And Krylov, on the basis of his theory of pitching, brilliantly proved that the yacht could not pass through the channel without damaging the bottom. The captain of the yacht was spared the inevitable punishment. The science of pitching developed by Krylov brought him worldwide fame. A.N. Krylov was invited to England to report on the theory of pitching at a meeting of the Society of English Naval Engineers. The report was a great success. The merits of the Russian scientist could not be underestimated. And in 1898, this society awards A.N. Krylov, the first of the foreigners, a gold medal. In the 35 years of the Society's existence, only 6 scientists have been awarded such a medal for outstanding discoveries in shipbuilding sciences, and all 6 were British. What phenomena are observed when the ship is rolling? And how can you prevent the consequences of pitching or at least neutralize it a little? There are 3 types of pitching: axial, or longitudinal, when the vessel oscillates around a transverse axis located somewhere in its middle part, side, or lateral, when the ship sways around the longitudinal axis, and vertical, when the mighty force of the surging sea, like on a huge elevator, lifts the entire hull of the ship up, in order to then lower it just as straight, into the abyss between the waves. All types of pitching in rough seas make themselves felt at the same time. Rolling is the most harmful for the human body and for the ship. What is required of any ship to successfully withstand such a roll? Even the ancient Roman scientist Seneca said, for a ship to be called good, it must be made unshakable. This means by all means to achieve moderation and smoothness of pitching from the ship. And the smoothness and moderation of the rocking of the vessel primarily depend on the size of the span and the period of rocking. Suppose we somehow rock the ship on still water. It will roll either to starboard or to port. The roll span is the angle of inclination of the vessel from the extreme position on one side to the extreme position on the other side. The roll span is the angle of inclination of the vessel from the extreme position on one side to the extreme position on the other side. And the pitching period is the time during which the ship makes a double swing, from side to side and back. Rolling period is a very important value. It is used to judge the nature of pitching. The shorter the period, the more impetuous the roll, the stronger it affects the human body, the strength of the ship's hull and the operation of the mechanisms. The smallest period of pitching, up to 12 seconds, usually happens with cargo ships. The largest, up to 30 seconds, for the largest passenger. A ship with a short period of rolling gets into the worst conditions even with a small wave. Conversely, a vessel with a long period of motion oscillates smoothly and is little influenced by waves. The rocking of a ship on calm water is called free, or natural vibrations. In the sea during waves, in addition to free, there are also forced oscillations of the ship from the action of waves. The forced oscillations of the ship have a period equal to the period of the waves rocking the ship. What is this period? The easiest way to determine this period is during a sea swell, that is, unrest with a calm wind. Then the waves move as it is depicted in theaters, and they move a huge canvas, and it seems to the audience that the sea is worried. Throughout the expanse of the sea, row after row, huge, rounded waves without foam crests run into the distance. This sea, brought out of rest, cannot calm down yet. Sea swell makes it easy to distinguish the highest place of the wave, its crest, and the lowest, the sole. Here we observe how the crest of one wave passed a certain point. Then the crest of the next wave passed through the same point. The period of a wave is the time it takes for two successive wave crests to pass through the same point. It is even easier to determine the period of the waves if you trace the swing of a buoy on a dead swell. To do this, of course, you need to have a stopwatch. The buoy will start to rise up, press the button. The buoy will fall to its original place and begin to rise again, stop the arrow. The stopwatch will just count the period of the wave in seconds. Wave sizes and periods are very large. In winter, waves up to 300 meters long and with a period of more than 12 seconds occur in the oceans. Their height reaches 12 meters, and sometimes up to 20 meters. The most dangerous for a ship during rolling is the case when the period of free oscillations of the ship coincides with the period of the wave. The pitching range immediately reaches 40 to 60 degrees. Here the ship may even capsize. To avoid this, experienced captains change course in a timely manner. They so direct the vessel relative to the crests of the waves, so as to immediately change the ratio between the period of free oscillations and the period of the wave. Then the ship will rock less and calmer. Scientists have long been trying to ensure that the pitching does not torment people and does not interfere with the work of sailors. As a result, many means were invented to calm the pitching, successful and unsuccessful. We will now tell about them. Roll stabilizers. To reduce rolling, side keels are installed. These are wide, downward-sloping, steel strips 400 to 700 mm wide. They are attached to the underwater part of the side, closer to the bottom, as the sailors say, on the cheekbone. The side keels restrain the ship's swings, slow them down, leaning on the water. It has been established by experience that side keels reduce the pitching range by 1/3. They do not save people from seasickness, but they reduce the harmful effect of pitching on the strength of the ship's hull. The side keels hold back the ship's swing. The first who tried to save people from the torment of rolling was the English engineer Bessemer. Bessemer was a metallurgist by profession. But an unforeseen circumstance forced him to become a shipbuilder. Once, while traveling by sea, Bessemer got into a severe storm. For many hours he pumped on the steamer, saw enough of the suffering of people from the terrible pitching. And Bessemer decided to create a ship where passengers would feel like they were on solid ground. For several years he achieved his goal, and in 1875, the unprecedented steamship Bessemer was launched. Outwardly, it did not differ much from other ships. But his insides amazed everyone. A huge box was fenced off in the middle part of the ship. It housed all the passenger quarters. The box was not one with the ship's hull. It seemed to be inserted inside the vessel and hung on axles to the frame, firmly connected to the hull. The box, as it were, was inserted inside the vessel and hung on axles to the frame, firmly connected to the hull. The frame was arranged in such a way that, no matter how the ship swayed, the box always remained in the same horizontal position. As conceived by Bessemer, this was supposed to save passengers from the trouble of rolling. Bessemer did not forget about the pitching of the steamer. To reduce its influence, he made the steamer very long and believed that he had done the right thing. It seemed that Bessemer had foreseen everything so that people would not suffer when rolling. Let the storm rage on the sea, let the ship rock as you like, this should not concern the passengers. But still Bessemer was not a specialist in shipbuilding. Therefore, he did not foresee the main thing, how such a ship would float. On the very first flight, this had an effect. Too heavy box, swinging on the frame, often upset the balance of the vessel. Bessemer was losing stability. A lot of trouble delivered to the captain and the long length of the ship. Such a ship did not obey the helm well. Once, at the entrance to the port of Calais, he completely refused to obey the helmsman. At full speed, the Bessemer crashed into a stone pier. Its bow was reduced to a mess of rubble. Bessemer did not repair his steamer. He lost forever all interest in shipbuilding. After Bessemer, many inventors and scientists worked on the creation of stabilizers. Many different systems have been proposed. But only a few of them have received the right to life and to be widely used. A very interesting type of stabilizer for warships was developed in 1894 by an outstanding naval commander and scientist, Admiral Stepan Osipovich Makarov. Admiral Stepan Osipovich Makarov, 1848 to 1904. The Makarov damper favorably differed from the dampers of other systems by the simplicity and cheapness of its device and, at the same time, by its strong resistance to rolling. Subsequently, the Fram damper, improved and adapted for merchant ships, appeared. Its device consists of two tanks, shielded along the sides of the ship. In height, they are located between the bottom and the deck. Their length is not more than 10 meters. The tanks are connected by a pipe or channel laid along the bottom. It turns out like communicating vessels, in which water is poured up to half the height. At the top, the tanks communicate with each other with an air pipe. A control valve is installed in the middle of the pipe. Through it, compressed air can be passed either into one or the other tank. How does this sedative work? Imagine a man with a yoke on his shoulders. Equal buckets filled with water are attached to the ends of the rocker. As long as the ends are balanced, it is easy for a person to swing the rocker. He can pump it so that the buckets will reach the ground. Now we will hang another full bucket on one end. There will be no such ease of swing. It is clear that the end with two buckets will rise slowly and with great effort. If we move the additional bucket to the other end of the rocker, we get the opposite picture. This bucket example is what we use to understand the operation of the Fram pacifier, Fram's sedative device. Here the steamer is rolling to the right. Then all the water is distilled to the right, but not immediately, but in small portions. If you overtake immediately, then the water with its weight will only help the pitching. And it is necessary, on the contrary, that it interfere. Water is distilled in such a way that the starboard tank is filled at the moment when this side begins to rise. Then a completely filled tank will be like an additional bucket on a rocker. It will reduce the swing. Then the left side begins to roll. Water is distilled in the same order to the left. When the left side begins to rise up, the fully filled tank of this side comes into action. It's like moving an extra bucket of water to the other end of the rocker. So the alternating transfusion of water from one side to the other reduces the swing by several times. The action of the Fram tanks was tested in the Russian fleet in 1913. Here is how Academician A.N. Krylov recalls this. A special commission was formed. They judged, rode for about 10 months, but came to nothing. Some say that Fram's sedatives must be used, others say that Fram's tanks are harmful, and everyone refers to foreign magazines. Finally, in February 1913, Minister of Marine Grigorovich appointed a meeting under his personal chairmanship. He listens to the conflicting opinions of the commission, which led to nothing, only spent time. And then he turns to me. What do you say? As long as we are guided by different journal articles, we will not come to anything. We must find a ship equipped with Fram tanks, appoint a commission of our officers to it, go to the ocean and carry out comprehensive tests, then we will receive our data, complete and verified. I am appointing such a commission under your chairmanship. Look for the ship, take with you whoever you want, and be at sea in a week. The Krylov Commission, having tested on the media steamer, convincingly proved that there is a benefit from the Fram tanks. The tanks were tested in a variety of sailing conditions, from light swell at sea to a severe 12-point storm. The capacity of the tanks was only 1.5% of the vessel's displacement, and the pitching range was reduced by a factor of 3 and 4. Now the filling of such tanks is carried out automatically, and therefore they are called active. There are also gyroscopic stabilizers, or gyroscopes. The main part of the gyroscope is a heavy disc that rotates around a vertical axis at a speed of up to 3,000 revolutions per minute. The axle is firmly fixed in a large frame, the supports of which are integral with the ship's hull. The frame sways on these supports in exactly the same way as the box of the Bessemer steamer swayed on its frame. As long as there is no pitching, the axis of the disc retains its vertical position. But here the roll begins. Here, an electric motor is immediately set in motion, rotating the disc. The disc becomes a spinning top, like the one we used to play in childhood. And, no matter how the disc tilts from rolling, its vertical axis, like the axis of any top, tends to maintain its former vertical position. This is where the gyroscope comes into play. Let us assume that the starboard side of the ship is rapidly leaning towards the water. Together with it, the vertical axis of the disc should also tilt. But she, by the property of a top, stubbornly resists such an inclination. And so the axis presses on the frame and through the frame supports, on the ship's hull. And it presses just in the direction opposite to the inclination of the vessel. So the gyroscope moderates the pitching of the ship. This is the so-called passive gyroscope damper. Recently, an active gyroscope damper has been installed more often. His frame swings on supports not by itself, but with the help of a special electric motor. This increases the pressure on the frame supports, which counteracts the roll of the vessel. The gyroscope is a huge machine. The disc diameter reaches 4 meters. Therefore, a special large room is allocated for gyroscopes. On a ship equipped with gyroscopes, the pitching is almost not felt. But on the other hand, the gyroscope is a very complex and expensive mechanism, and therefore it has not yet received wide distribution for calming the pitching. But the idea of a gyroscope is widely used in the construction of various devices. Recently, they came up with new pitching dampers. These are zygomatic controlled rudders. Recently, they came up with new pitching dampers, zygomatic rudders. They resemble lateral keels, but the side keels are fixed to the hull. And the zygomatic rudders can be automatically rotated by a special motor up and down. They are always put in the most advantageous position, so that they, like the wings of an airplane, create lift on the move of the ship. It is this force that prevents roll. Experience with these dampers has shown that they are good only for high-speed vessels. When there is no pitching, the rudders are retracted into the hull, into special pockets. This is done so that they do not slow down the movement of the vessel. Everything that is said here about dampers refers to rolling. And what is being done to reduce pitching? Here, special pacifiers are not used. The efforts of the designers are aimed at improving, if possible, the shape of the surface part of the bow of the vessel. For example, they make her collapse towards the sides, so that the ship burrows less, ascending the wave. Speed is an important quality of a ship. Every ship, even before it is built, is assigned to a specific job. Everything is clarified for him in advance, how much cargo and what exactly it will carry, where and at what speed to go. Speed is an important quality of a ship. The faster it is, the more useful it is. Whether it is goods, fuel, timber for construction sites or personal luggage of passengers, any cargo must be delivered as quickly as possible. And people are always in a hurry. It rarely happens that a person leaves without haste. Everyone tries to get on a high-speed train or steamer. It is generally accepted that the more powerful a vessel has its mechanisms, the faster it is. But this opinion is not entirely correct. A ship can have very powerful machinery and still be a poor walker. Why? Yes, because the ship does not float in vacuum, but in water. Water prevents the steamer from moving freely. She resists the movement of the ship. A floating steamer spends the power of its mechanisms mainly on overcoming the resistance of the water. It has been established that water resistance depends primarily on the size and shape of the ship's hull. This is very easy to check. Try to move a small board against the current of the river. First turn it across the stream, and then try to put it along the stream, but first. You will immediately feel the difference in water resistance. And if you take a larger board, then this difference will be even more noticeable. It is unlikely that you will agree to ride the oars in a bulky fishing launch. You will have a hard job. And the barge will barely move. But with what pleasure you will race on a light kayak. The kayak has a well-streamlined hull shape and encounters little water resistance. The kayak has a well-streamlined hull shape. Water resists the movement of a short and wide steamer more than a narrow and long one. No wonder high-speed vessels have an elongated hull. The shape of such a hull is sharp, convenient for a smooth flow around water. To make a short and wide steamer go at the same speed as a long and narrow steamer of the same displacement, it is necessary to install mechanisms of greater power on it. And it will consume much more fuel. But on the other hand, its stability will be better, and the placement of goods will be easier. The designer working on the project of the ship is required to ensure the highest possible speed, but that the power of the mechanisms is not great and the ship consumes less fuel. The designer begins his work by selecting the most advantageous dimensions and shape of the ship's hull. It's not easy. Science has not yet found formulas for solving such a problem. Here you have to resort to the wise advice of the great Italian scientist Leonardo da Vinci: when dealing with water, first consult experience. And the designer uses the experience of already built ships. Among them, he is looking for a vessel that, in terms of size and shape of the hull, would most resemble what they want to build. Here is something suitable. Then, according to his model, they sketch out a drawing of the contours of the hull of a new vessel. The drawing of the contours of the hull is called theoretical, because it serves as the basis for all subsequent theoretical calculations. On the theoretical drawing, everything seems to be fine, both the dimensions are suitable, and the contours of the body are beautiful and smooth. And yet, a check is required. What if the new steamer turns out to be slow-moving? But how to check it? This can be done only after the construction and testing of the steamer at sea. But then it will be too late. The steamboat is not a toy boat. He trimmed the one with a knife, corrected the nose and sides, and everything is in order. You can't do that with a ship. How can you find out in advance that the chosen hull shape is the most successful? To do this, they came up with the idea of testing ship models in experimental pools. The experimental pool is a long and bright room. In the middle of it, a canal was laid with a length of 200 meters or more, and a width of 6 to 12 meters. Concrete parts with rails are laid on both sides of the canal. A test trolley towing a model ship runs along the rails above the water. A trolley towing a model runs along the rails above the water. The model is made exactly according to the theoretical drawing of the new ship, usually on a scale of 1/25th or 50th of natural size. The material is paraffin. It is easily machined. If the model is small, then it is cast. To do this, a hollow mold is constructed from clay, which is filled with paraffin. Most often, they act differently. The skeleton of the model is knocked together from thin rails, covered with a cloth and placed in a clay mold. Small gaps are left between the walls of the mold and the canvas of the model, which are filled with paraffin. When the paraffin hardens, the model is removed from the mold and taken to a special machine. The cutter of the machine grinds the model to the required size and shape. Then it is carefully polished, achieving a perfectly smooth surface. Sometimes the model is made of wood, from linden. Then it is covered with a special paint that protects it from soaking and warping. The finished model is transferred from the model workshop to the pool. Here, a test cart awaits her. Spring scales hang from it to the water, similar in appearance to a domestic steelyard. This is a dynamometer for measuring the force of water resistance. The model is attached to it. Here the trolley motor turns on and it rushes forward, dragging the model along the water. The movement of the model meets the resistance of the water. From this, a dynamometer spring connected to a self-recording device is stretched. And the device directly in kilograms records the value of water resistance. The model is towed along the canal several times. And each time they notice the reading of the self-recording device, as well as the speed of movement. And then, with the help of special calculations, they move from the resistance value of the model to the resistance of the ship itself. According to the value of resistance found, it is already easy to determine, using a special formula, what power the engine must be put on the ship so that it has a given speed. And if excessive power is required, this means that the dimensions and shape of the ship's hull are chosen poorly. Then everything starts again, and they correct the theoretical drawing, make a new model and again drive it in the pool. Sometimes the designer's failure is revealed already at the beginning of the test, when the model is just starting to move. The herald of such failure is the waves bred by the model. If they are too large, you cannot continue the test. For testers, it is already clear that the chosen dimensions and shape of the ship's hull are unsuccessful. As you can see, testing a ship model is a complex and painstaking task, especially when developing a project for a new ship that is not similar to previously built ones. Then you have to redo the model many times until you get the desired shape of the ship's hull. Academician A. N. Krylov said that when choosing the dimensions and contours of the hull of a battleship of the Sevastopol type, 20 different models were run in the experimental pool. And at first they wanted to use the model of the already built battleship Andrew I Gold. Further tests showed what could have happened if the testers had opted for the model of the battleship St. Andrew I Gold, did not continue to work on improving the contours of the hull of the new ship. In other words, what would have happened if the hull of the battleship Sevastopol had been built according to the theoretical drawing of St. Andrew I Gold? It would have turned out that the Sevastopol battleship would have had to be supplied with main mechanisms twice as powerful as those that were actually installed. And they were convinced of this only after they tested 24 different models. That's how important it is to test ship models in a test basin. There are also such pools where the model is not towed by a self-propelled cart, but by a falling weight. Here, the weight of the falling weight forces the model to move with the help of an endless cable sliding along the guide blocks. In such pools, small models are tested at relatively low travel speeds. There is another type of test pools for testing ship models for agility. These pools are not rectangular, but round. Sometimes they take place outdoors. Here, large self-propelled models controlled by radio rush and turn in all directions. Their bizarre movements are filmed. Recording instruments note the rudder angles, speed and roll, as well as the force acting on the rudder. After that, it is determined how the shifting of the rudder to different angles at different speeds will affect the agility of the vessel, and also calculate the required power of the steering machine. The method of testing models in the pool has existed in our country for over 60 years. The initiator of the construction of the first St. Petersburg experimental pool in Russia in 1892 was the great Russian scientist Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev. Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev, 1834–1907. This basin, where academician Krylov also worked, played a huge role in the development of Russian shipbuilding. For high-speed vessels, it is necessary to reckon not only with water resistance. When developing projects for such ships, air or wind resistance, which creates a headwind in the sea, is also taken into account. For particularly high-speed ships, air resistance is determined in the same way as for airplanes, that is, by blowing a ship model in a wind tunnel. Now it becomes clear why on high-speed passenger. In ships, superstructures are given a smooth streamlined shape, although they are not submerged in water. So this is how much trouble the increase in the speed of the ship creates for designers. In the capitalist world, the struggle for speed has long since turned into a continuous and cruel struggle, in which every capitalist tries to bite his competitor. After all, in order to get as much profit as possible, everyone is trying to lure passengers and cargo onto their ships. And for this you need to win the championship at all costs, to intercept the blue ribbon, a prize for the highest speed of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And now, for the sake of advertising, high-speed transatlantic giants are being built, one is faster than the other and one is larger than the other. Speed for the sake of speed. And if in 1830 the English steamer Sirius, the first owner of the blue ribbon, crossed the ocean in 15 days, then the current record holders make the same trip 4 times faster. Not always the fight for the blue ribbon went well. For the sake of profits, the capitalists do not shun any means. There were cases when a frantic race brought death to hundreds of people and the ship itself. We will tell about one of these cases. Drama in the ocean. On April 10, 1912, the new British steamship Titanic set out on its maiden voyage. A huge ship with a displacement of about 52,000 tons was led by Captain Smith, an old sea dog. He had sailed for over 40 years on the White Star steamships and was about to retire. But he was persuaded for the last time to conduct a flight to America. The leaders of the company hoped to win the blue ribbon with the help of an experienced captain. And the captain agreed. He was seduced by the large pension promised to him upon retirement. And among the passengers were the chairman of the company, Ismay Bruce, and the builder of the Titanic himself, Engineer Andrews. The Titanic went on its maiden voyage. For 3 days the ship raced at a speed of 22 knots. At the end of the 4th day, the Titanic found itself already at the island of Newfoundland. It was 11 o'clock in the evening. The concert ball in the music hall has just ended. Many passengers were getting ready for bed. A thick darkness hung over the ocean. The brightly lit steamer seemed like a fabulous island in the blackness of the ocean. But the island did not stand still. He moved forward with great speed. Part of the crew of the steamer carried a tense watch. On the bow of the ship and in the observation posts on the foremast, sentinels were constantly on duty. The officer in charge of the watch, Murdoch, stood motionless on the bridge. He kept looking ahead. It looked like he was in for some trouble. And the trouble was really coming. An hour ago, the duty radio operator handed Murdoch an alarming radio message. The steamer California, a few miles from the Titanic, reported that it was surrounded by ice floes. The encounter with the ice was inevitable. We should report this to the captain. But Murdoch was in no hurry with the report. He well remembered the conversation that had taken place on the bridge at the beginning of his watch. That's what Captain Smith and the chairman of the company, Ismay Bruce, were talking about then. Sir, allow me to report that the ship is in great danger. Which? Danger of colliding with an ice floe. Now is the time of the biggest ice drift in the ocean. We might even run into an ice field. Many ice floes reach the height of a large mountain, and underwater they are even bigger. A collision with such a mountain, and even at full speed, is the sure death of the ship. What are you offering? Ismay Bruce interrupted the captain coldly. I propose to change the course of the ship and go south, bypassing the ice. This is impossible. We must move along the straight, shortest path. Remember the blue ribbon, sir. Let me at least slow down. Less likely to collide with an ice floe. And if misfortune happens, then hitting an ice floe will not be so dangerous. Remember that we have 2,200 human lives on our conscience. But Ismay Bruce stood his ground. Captain Smith didn't object. Why lose such a tempting pension? That's why Murdoch decided not to disturb the captain. The ship continued its rapid run. The decks were dead silent. Suddenly this silence was broken by the sharp sounds of a gong coming from the mast. Then they shouted from there. Right on the nose of the ice mountain. Indeed, a huge ice floe was advancing on the ship in front. Left aboard, shouted Murdoch, and frantically tugged at the handle of the machine's telegraph. The arrow pointer turned, stop. Without waiting for the steamer to stop, Murdoch again turned the handle to full back. But it was already too late. The mass of steel collided with the mass of ice. Only the sailors on duty and third-class passengers located in the bow of the ship immediately learned about the disaster. A few minutes later Captain Smith and Engineer Andrews descended here. A terrible sight met their eyes. 10 seconds was enough for the ice floe to cut through the side plating for a length of about 100 meters. The water was noisily pouring into the hold. 5 bow compartments were already filled. Water penetrated to the lowest deck and through its loose places overflowed further and further into the aft compartments. The steamboat will last no more than an hour on the water, Andrews said, and then he remembered the meeting with the Russian engineer Vladimir Polyevtovich Kostenko. They were talking then, standing at the hull of the Titanic, which was still under construction. A Russian engineer specially came to Belfast to get acquainted with the structure of the steamer. With what knowledge of the matter Kostenko proved then that the Titanic's hull had major flaws, and they especially related to the ship's unsinkability. But Andrews did not listen to the Russian engineer. He firmly believed that no one was better than the British at building steamboats. Andrews made it clear that it was impolite, to say the least, for a Russian to teach him, England's best shipbuilder. Kostenko's last words at parting were, "Remember, Mr. Andrews, one big hole and the Titanic will be gone." Everything turned out as Kostenko predicted. In vain did Andrews not listen then to the Russian engineer. Here comes the retribution for stupid pride. The position of the Titanic became hopeless. Captain Smith gave the order to launch the lifeboats. Here again a miscalculation turned out, that the lifeboats could take only half of the people. The rest were doomed to death. 2 hours after hitting the ice floe, the bridge went underwater. But the aft quarters still shone with blinding light. Then immediately darkness fell. With a deafening roar, cars and boilers broke from their seats. The Titanic stood for several minutes, raising its stern to the sky. He seemed to say goodbye to the people who filled the lifeboats and floated on the water, and then quickly disappeared under the water. A special court in London sat for 3 months and found that the culprit in the sinking of the ship and 1,500 people was Captain Smith. The fault of the captain, of course, is indisputable. He shouldn't have listened to Ismay Bruce. The captain atoned for his guilt by death. He died along with his ship. But the main culprit must be considered the leaders of the shipping company, headed by Ismay Bruce. By the way, this man did not drown. He quietly slipped into one of the boats and hid behind the backs of the women. So safely and he got to the shores of America. Namely, these capitalists had to pass the most severe sentence for the fact that they cared about profit, and not about the safety of people. Part 3. How the steamboat is built. Where ships are born. Since time immemorial, man has unconsciously used the laws of buoyancy. Over 2,200 years have passed since the Archimedes law became known. But only in the last 200 or 300 years have people begun to take a reasonable approach to the construction of a ship. For a long time, shipbuilding was an art known only to a small number of craftsmen. It happened that they would ask such a bearded craftsman, hewing the beams of the ship's hull with an axe, "How do you, brother, draw such smooth sides?" "How?" But if you stand and move your eye along the side, it is immediately visible. Where it is uneven, you plan it, and where you put an extra bookmark. Everyone does it. And my great-grandfather did the same? Generations accumulated precious experience. The secrets of the craft were passed down as the most precious thing in the family, from father to son. So, in England, for about 200 years, the name of the Petts thundered, a family that knew how to build especially successful ships. It is clear that they were built in the old-fashioned way, without any calculations and wise projects, but according to the grandfather's secret precepts. In France in the middle of the 17th century, there were 500 shipbuilders. But of these, 496 even had a poor idea of what depends on what when choosing the size and shape of the ship. Somehow they could still calculate the displacement of an already built vessel. But no one could predict in advance the seaworthiness of the ship under construction. What draft he would have, how many guns or cargo he would take, could be found out only after the ship was launched and equipped. But in 1666, the English master Anthony Deane publicly announced the draft of the battleship Rupert, which was still on the slipway. This interested everyone so much that the king himself came to the solemn ceremony of descent with all the admirals and retinue. Of course, none of them believed Deane. And what was the general surprise when the launched ship sat in the water exactly at that depth of draft, which was predicted by the ship's master? His Majesty was overjoyed. Anthony Deane was the first shipbuilder to apply mathematics to accurately design a ship. But to draw up a project means to determine the most favorable dimensions and outlines of the hull and all the qualities of the ship before the start of its construction. Since then, the science and technology of shipbuilding have gone far ahead. Now nothing is done by eye and the old-fashioned way. The time of hereditary masters who know the secret old-fashioned tricks has passed. Now everything is subordinated to a single engineering project confirmed by calculations. But when drafting a modern ship, one has to deal with a steel hull, and with various mechanisms, and with electrical equipment, and with navigational instruments. No one can know all these various elements of the ship equally well. That is why the ship is designed not by one, not by several people, but by hundreds of designers of a wide variety of specialties, assembled in a design bureau. They work in huge drawing rooms. At their disposal are rich technical libraries, laboratories, smart computers, workshops and pools for testing ship models. Project development is a very complex and long process. It happens that it lasts longer than the construction of the ship. Imagine such a gigantic structure as a modern 12-deck steamer 300 meters long. After all, this is a whole floating city, with many powerful mechanisms and complex devices, power plants, hundreds of residential and office premises, in a word, with everything that 400 to 500 of its inhabitants will require. But this city does not stand, but moves along the waves of the ocean, and even at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Such a ship is assembled from tens of thousands of different parts, from huge, like a house, steel hull structures to the most accurate and small parts of the equipment. The fate of the vessel, and hence the lives of hundreds and thousands of people, depends on each of the details, on how they are fitted to each other. Correcting any flaw when sewing a suit is easy. And try to reshape and remake an already assembled assembly of a mechanism or a ship's hull made of solid metal. Hardly anything will come of it. And if it does, it will be with great difficulty and cost of money. Therefore, everything must be foreseen and planned in advance, on paper, in the drawings. To build a ship, you need to know to the smallest detail how it will look and what will be required for its equipment and equipment. How much and what materials will be needed for it. You need to be sure in advance of its strength, that it will take exactly as much cargo as expected, that the voyage will be both safe and fast. We already know that any vessel can be made fast if an engine of the appropriate power is installed on it. But you can't do that. After all, such an engine will sometimes weigh and take up so much space that the ship will have nowhere to take cargo. And if you increase the size of the vessel in order to still take the load, then the resistance of water to the movement of the vessel will increase. And it will be necessary, in order not to reduce speed, or to put the engine even more powerful than before. There is only one way out of this vicious circle. You need to correctly combine all these conflicting aspirations, so that neither speed increases at the expense of carrying capacity, nor vice versa. A reasonable solution to these issues largely depends on how well the dimensions and shape of the ship's hull are chosen. How much cargo the future ship should take and what approximate speed it should have, the designers know from the task. Therefore, the development of the project begins with determining the dimensions of the vessel, which would fit both the required amount of cargo and the engine. After a suitable hull shape has been selected and a theoretical drawing has been drawn, the displacement is calculated. And at the same time, according to the theoretical drawing, a model is made, which is tested in the experimental pool. How tests are carried out, you already know. As a result of the tests, they specify what power the engine should have in order for the ship to move at a given speed, and improve the shape of the hull. Designers show a lot of ingenuity when they draw up general arrangement drawings. It is not easy to accommodate many mechanisms, devices and rooms in the limited space of a steamer. In the spacious buildings of a factory or plant, this would not cause any difficulties. It's a different matter on a ship, where every square meter of area has to be taken into account. Simultaneously with the preparation of design drawings, the necessary calculations are made. According to the theoretical drawing, the seaworthiness of the ship is determined by buoyancy, stability, unsinkability and controllability. If they turn out to be bad, then you have to redo the project again. When calculating unsinkability, the required number of bulkheads is found. After all, it is necessary to divide the hull into compartments so that in the event of an accident and filling with water, even two adjacent compartments at once, the ship still does not sink. Designers do a lot of work in order to select the type and size of the parts of the steamer's hull so that it is durable. How is this body built?